At 6:42 p.m. at the dinner table, my daughter slid a stack of papers in front of me and said, "Dad, just sign it. It'll make things easier for me to manage." I looked down and saw it was authorization for her to control $3.8 million from my late wife's trust. They thought I was old weak, someone who would sign without understanding. But I didn't. I simply placed a photo on the table, and the moment they saw it, everyone froze in disbelief. They thought they had everything under control. They were wrong. I was the one in control. This story starts quietly, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we begin, drop a quick comment. Is it morning, afternoon, or evening where you are? Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs today. Just a note, certain details have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection. What matters is the message at its heart. My daughter didn't shout when she decided I no longer mattered. She simply looked at me across the dinner table and said it like a fact. At 72, I'd spent 38 years as a cardiologist, diagnosing cardiac failure, reading EKGs, interpreting the small signs that signaled catastrophe. I should have been better at reading people. Specifically, I should have been better at reading Simone. The dining room smelled like rosemary, and roasted chicken steam curling from the serving platter in the center of our walnut table. November 17th, 6:42. In the evening, pre-Thanksgiving calm, settling over the Austin house like it had for decades. Simone sat across from me in her cream blazer, still wearing her fundraising director polish from whatever hospital event she'd attended that afternoon. 43 years old, poised, articulate, my only child. "The gala raised $40,000 this quarter," she said, cutting her chicken with precise movements. "Neurology wing expansion." Grant, her husband, scrolled through his phone beside her. 46, independent investment advisor, the kind of man who treated family dinners like conference calls he was too important to fully attend. He made a non-committal sound, without looking up. Lily, their 13-year-old daughter, had her algebra homework spread beside her salad plate pencil, moving in small, deliberate strokes. She had Constance's eyes, my late wife's quiet observation, the way she noticed everything, and said little. Elena moved through the kitchen archway, 48, and efficient, wiping down counters that didn't need wiping. She'd worked for Simone for 3 years, and lately I'd noticed her lingering during conversations, present but invisible. I picked up my water glass, casual. I noticed a bank envelope didn't make it to me this week. Simone set down her fork. Not dropped, set. Controlled. "Dad, you don't even pay for anything here anymore." The room didn't explode. That's what I remember most. The silence that followed wasn't shocked or uncomfortable. It was expected. Practiced, even. Grant kept scrolling. Didn't flinch, didn't object, didn't do what a son-in-law does when his wife crosses a line with her elderly father. He just kept reading market data like Simone had commented on the weather. Lily's pencil stopped moving. Her head dipped lower over the homework shoulders, tightening, but she didn't look up. Didn't say, "Mom, that's mean," the way children do when adults misbehave. She just made herself smaller. Elena in the kitchen paused mid-wipe. I caught her reflection in the window glass she'd heard registered, then returned to the counter like this was a scene she'd witnessed before. I looked at my daughter. Really looked. The statement hadn't been angry. Anger I could have worked with. Anger meant something still mattered enough to fight over. This was colder. This was a fact she'd been carrying for a while, something that had lived in her mind long enough to lose its sharp edges and become simply true. "I see," I said. 2 words. That's all I gave her. Not an argument, not a defense of how a retired cardiologist on a fixed income contributes to a household, or why a father moving in with his daughter after his wife dies shouldn't be treated like a burden who's overstayed. Just, "I see." I set down my fork, not dropped, set the way she had, and stood. My chair made a small sound against the hardwood. Simone watched me with that same detached expression, the one I'd seen her use at hospital galas, when dismissing vendors or declining donations that didn't meet her threshold? When did children stop seeing their parents as people and start seeing them as expenses? I walked out of the dining room. Not dramatically. No door slamming, no pronouncements. I just walked into the hallway outside what used to be my office, the one Constance had decorated with bookshelves and the antique desk her grandmother left her. Yellow light from the lamp Constance had hated overhead lighting, said it was too clinical, cast the hallway in the kind of warmth that felt like a memory now. Her photograph hung where it always had silver frame against cream wallpaper. Constance at 68, a year before the stroke, smiling at something I'd said behind the camera. She'd been a hospital administrator for 30 years, understood institutional politics, human nature, the way people revealed themselves under pressure. 8 months since she died. Some days it felt like 8 years. Tonight, it felt like 8 minutes. I pulled out my phone. Charles answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting. Charles Whitmore, 65, silver-haired and meticulous, had handled the Hale family legal affairs for 23 years. He'd drafted our wills, managed Constance's estate, witnessed the trust documents she'd insisted on revising 6 months before her death. At the time, I thought she was being thorough. Now I wondered what she'd seen that I'd missed. "Charles," I said quietly, "it's time." A pause. Not surprise, not confusion. Just a pause like a doctor confirming a diagnosis he'd already suspected. Did she say it? Not, "What happened?" Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "What do you mean?" Did she say it? Like we'd been waiting for Simone to say something specific. Like this phone call wasn't the beginning of anything, it was the trigger. Almost word for word, I said. I heard him exhale. "I'll pull the files tonight. Can you be at my office tomorrow morning?" 9 o'clock. "Everett," he said, and his voice carried the weight of something I hadn't heard in it before. Not pity. Something closer to resolve. Constance knew. I looked at her photograph in the yellow lamplight. Constance, who'd insisted on the trust revisions. Constance, who'd made Charles promise to keep certain documents sealed until specific conditions were met. Constance, who'd looked at our daughter 6 months before dying and seen something I was only now beginning to recognize. "I know," I said. I had performed thousands of surgeries, diagnosed countless conditions, learned to compartmentalize grief and fear and the weight of holding a human heart in my hands. But nothing prepared me for the moment your child becomes someone you no longer recognize, and realizing your late wife had recognized it first. Charles didn't ask what Simone had done. He asked if she had finally said the words we'd been waiting 8 months to hear. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, he said on the phone, his voice carrying the measured calm of a man executing a plan rather than reacting to a crisis. "Don't confront her, not yet. We need to see what she does next." I stood in the hallway, Constance's photograph, watching me from the wall. Behind me, through the dining room archway, I could hear the scrape of silverware on plates resuming. Normal conversation like nothing had fractured. Simone asking Lily about a school project. Grant's phone chiming with a market alert. "How long do you think she's been planning this?" I asked. "If she's willing to say it at dinner," Charles said, "she's ready for the next step. Whatever that is, we need to document it. No confrontations, no arguments, just observation." "You sound like we've done this before. We established the protocol in June," he reminded me. "The day you moved in with her. You called me from the San Antonio house and said something felt wrong. Remember, I did. Barely." Grief had made everything feel wrong that month. "Don't sign anything without calling me first," Charles continued. "Don't agree to any financial changes, medical appointments, legal consultations. Nothing. If she pushes, tell her you need time to think. And if she doesn't push, if tonight was just Everett." His voice sharpened. "People who humiliate their parents at dinner don't stop there. This was a test. She wanted to see if you'd fight back." I looked at Constance's photograph. She'd known. Somehow, she'd known. 9 o'clock, I said, and ended the call. The memory hit me like a second diagnosis, the kind that reframes everything you thought you understood. June 12th. 8 months after Constance's stroke. 8 months after the Tuesday morning in March, when I'd found her on the bathroom floor, left side, paralyzed eyes trying to communicate something her mouth could no longer form. 3 days in ICU. 45 years of marriage ending in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and failing systems. The San Antonio house, our house, felt haunted by June. Cardboard boxes stacked in rooms where Constance's routines had once created order. The dark blue moving truck idling in the driveway, 2 men in matching shirts waiting for me to finish my last walkthrough. I'd stood in the kitchen where Constance had made coffee every morning for 4 decades, her absence so dense it had physical weight. She'd been a hospital administrator for 32 years, the kind of woman who understood institutional dysfunction and human nature in equal measure. Without her, the house wasn't home. It was just square footage and mortgage payments, and a yard I no longer had the energy to tend. Grief is a fog that makes predators look like rescuers and cages look like shelters. Simone had arrived at 10:15 that morning, punctual and prepared. 42, then wearing a navy pantsuit and the expression of someone executing a well-rehearsed intervention. "Dad, you can't manage this house alone," she'd said, walking through rooms she'd grown up in, like they were evidence in a case she was building. What if something happens? What if you fall, have a medical emergency, can't reach the phone? Grant had followed behind her, 45, and carrying a leather folder I hadn't asked to see. "From a liability standpoint, consolidating makes sense," he'd said. "House this size, property taxes, maintenance costs. At your age, simpler is safer. At your age." The phrase people use when they've decided you're no longer capable of deciding for yourself. "You'll stay with us," Simone had continued. "We have the guest suite. Lily would love having you closer. And honestly, Dad, I'll sleep better knowing you're not alone." It had all sounded so reasonable through the fog. A daughter caring for her widowed father. A family pulling together after loss. I'd been so deep in grief I couldn't see the architecture underneath the concern. But I remember one moment. One small detail I dismissed then but couldn't dismiss now. Simone had turned to Grant, voice dropping to what she thought was private volume. "Are the proceeds handled?" Grant had nodded, checking his phone. "By end of week." Not "how is Dad doing?" Not "should we give him more time?" Just "are the proceeds handled?" The house hadn't even sold yet. I hadn't signed the listing agreement. But they were already discussing proceeds. I had spent 38 years reading hearts on monitors, learning to interpret the small variations in rhythm that signaled catastrophe. But I never learned to read the heart sitting across from me at dinner, planning my diminishment, while I grieved her mother. The memory shifted, pulling me further back. March, 3 days before the stroke. Constance had been organizing her office. She always organized when something worried her, creating order as a bulwark against chaos. I'd found her standing at her desk, looking at family photographs she'd arranged in chronological order. Simone at 5, gap-toothed and laughing. Simone at 16, already poised and calculating angles. Simone at 35, holding infant Lily with an expression that looked more like achievement than affection. "Promise me something," Constance had said, not looking up from the photographs. "Anything. Don't let grief sign anything for you." I'd laughed. Actually laughed. "You're being dramatic. I'm 71, not incompetent. And Simone would never. I hope you're right." She'd turned, then gripping my hand with surprising urgency. Her eyes, the same eyes Lily had inherited, were clear and focused. "But promise me anyway. If something happens to me, don't make major decisions for at least a year. Don't sign anything without getting it reviewed. Don't let anyone convince you that grief makes you incapable." Constance. Promise. I'd promised. Then I had promptly broken that promise 6 months later, when Simone had convinced me to sell the house, liquidate assets, simplify my life by moving into her guest suite. Standing in the Austin hallway 17 months after that conversation, I finally understood. Constance hadn't been dramatic. She'd been diagnostic. She'd seen something in our daughter that I'd refused to acknowledge the way a cardiologist sees the arrhythmia a patient insists is nothing. She'd tried to warn me, and I'd laughed. The question wasn't whether Constance had been right. The question was, what else had she seen, and more importantly, what else had she done to protect me from the daughter I'd been too blind to see clearly? The first time my daughter told me how to take my own blood pressure medication, I thought she was being helpful. The 10th time, I understood it was something else. October 3rd. 5 weeks before the dinner humiliation, I learned what Constance had tried to warn me about. Not in dramatic confrontations, but in small erosions, so gradual, I almost didn't recognize them as attacks. I poured my second cup of coffee at 8:05 that morning, the kind of mundane decision I'd made thousands of times without consultation. The kitchen smelled like the dark roast Constance had always bought, but one of the few things I'd insisted on keeping unchanged. Steam rose from the ceramic mug as I added cream. Simone entered wearing her cream blazer, already dressed for a breakfast meeting with hospital donors. She glanced at my mug, then at the nearly empty pot. "Dad, you've already had coffee," she said, not quite a question. "At your age, 2 cups is really too much." I looked at her. 43 years old, my daughter offering cardiac advice to a man who'd performed catheterizations on failing hearts for nearly 4 decades. "I performed cardiac procedures for 30 years, I said quietly, "which is exactly why you should know better." She moved to the cabinet, pulled out a blue tin of decaf. "Caffeine affects blood pressure, Dad. Decaf from now on, okay. Not a suggestion. An instruction delivered with the gentle firmness nurses use on non-compliant patients." I set down the cup without drinking it. Not because she was right, my blood pressure had been textbook perfect at my last checkup, but because arguing felt like proving her point. 10 minutes later, she organized my pill container on the counter. Blue plastic, 7 compartments, the kind sold in pharmacy checkout aisles for people who needed visual reminders not to overdose. "This one is for your heart, Dad," she said, holding up the metoprolol like I'd never seen it before. "Take it with breakfast, remember." "Simone, I know what metoprolol is." I'd prescribed it to hundreds of patients, calculated dosages, explained side effects, monitored interactions. "Of course you do. I just want to make sure you don't forget." She moved to the next bottle. Atorvastatin for cholesterol. Aspirin for clot prevention. Each one labeled, explained, organized like I was a child learning to spell. "We could set alarms on your phone," she suggested, snapping the organizer closed. "Morning, noon, evening. That way you won't have to remember. Won't have to remember." As if remembering were already beyond me. Infantilization is a slow poison, each small dose harmless, each accumulation deadly. I mentioned driving to the library. Just mentioned it the way one adult tells another about plans that don't require permission. Her face shifted. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around her eyes. The expression I'd seen her use when Lily asked for something that required negotiation. "The library, what for? We can order any book you want online. I enjoy browsing." "But Dad, what if you get disoriented? It's across town, the parking is complicated, and you haven't driven much since you moved in." "I drove to that library for 15 years when we visited you," I said. "The route hasn't changed. Still." She wiped down the counter, the same spot 3 times. "Maybe Grant could take you. Or we could go together this weekend. I just worry about you driving alone." Each question, each alternative, each expression of worry, they all communicated the same thing. My independence wasn't a right. It was a privilege she could grant or withhold based on criteria she alone determined. Lily appeared in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, sleep still softening her 13-year-old features. She poured cereal, moving around her mother's organizing performance, with practiced efficiency. Simone stepped out to take a phone call, her voice drifting from the hallway, in professional tones about quarterly fundraising targets. Lily looked at me over her cornflakes. "Grandpa, why does Mom talk to you like you're a patient?" The question landed like a diagnosis I'd been avoiding. What do you mean, sweetheart? Like, she searched for words. Like you don't know things, but you're a doctor. You taught at medical school. Why does she explain your own medicine to you? If you've ever been treated like a child by someone you raised, you know that particular species of rage. It doesn't explode. It accumulates cold and precise in the space between what's said and what's meant. Your mom worries, I said carefully. That's what people who love you do. But you're not confused, are you? No, Lily, I'm not confused. She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she returned to her cereal, but I caught her watching her mother when Simone came back into the room. Simone noticed my car keys on the counter where I'd left them the night before. She picked them up, weighing them in her palm like evidence. Dad, let's hold on to these for now, she said, her voice carrying that terrible gentleness people use when delivering bad news they're secretly pleased about. Just until we know you're steady. Steady, I stood. I'm perfectly capable of driving. I know you think you are. She slipped the keys into her blazer pocket, the small clink of metal disappearing into fabric. But I've noticed some things. Little things, forgetfulness, confusion about times. I think we should talk to your doctor, make sure everything's okay. I haven't been confused about anything. Dad, you asked me twice yesterday what day it was. I hadn't. I'd asked once what date it was because I'd been writing a check, and the month had changed. A normal question now reframed as evidence of cognitive decline. We'll talk to Dr. Morrison, she continued, already moving toward the door like the conversation had concluded. Get you a full workup, make sure we're not missing anything. In the meantime, Grant or I can drive you anywhere you need to go, okay? Not okay. Not remotely okay. But she'd already left the kitchen, my car keys secured in her pocket, my independence revoked with a sympathetic smile. Lily stared at her cereal bowl. Grandpa, she whispered, did you really ask twice about the day? No, I said, I didn't. She nodded once, understanding something that would take me weeks longer to fully grasp. Simone wasn't documenting my decline. She was inventing it. And if she was lying to me about what I'd said and done, what was she telling others? I learned Elena wasn't cleaning my room when I heard the camera click, soft, digital, deliberate, while my eyes stayed closed. October 8th, 5 days after Simone confiscated my car keys, I discovered who else was helping build the incompetence narrative. The answer was the woman who'd been dusting my nightstand for 3 years. I'd gone to my bedroom after lunch, telling no one, closing the door most of the way, but not latching it. Old habit from decades of hospital call shifts: never fully close a door when you might need to respond quickly. I stretched out on the bed shoes, off maintaining the slow, steady breathing of afternoon sleep. Elena entered at 1:15. I heard the doorknob turn, the whisper of hinges, her footsteps careful on the hardwood floor. She didn't go to the cleaning supplies, didn't dust the furniture or straighten the bookshelf. She went directly to my desk. The drawer opened with a quiet slide, papers rustling, then the camera click. I kept my breathing even, eyes closed, except for the barest slit, enough to see shapes and movement, not enough to be obvious if she glanced over. Another click. Then her voice whispered to herself, trust documents, prescription labels. Good. She moved to my nightstand. More clicks. The orange prescription bottles Simone had organized so carefully, each one photographed from angles that would capture the label, the dosage, my name. Sleeping pills, Elena whispered. She'll want to see this. The pills Simone had suggested 2 days ago. Pills I hadn't started taking. Pills that would appear in whatever file Elena was building as evidence of sleep disturbance, confusion, medical decline. I tracked her movements through barely open eyes, maintaining the rhythm of sleep breathing I'd perfected during decades of power naps between surgeries. Elena checked the medicine organizer Simone had set up, photographed it from 3 angles. She opened the desk drawer again, found bank statements I'd left visible, photographed those too. Then she moved to the closet. My gaze shifted slightly, landing on the bookshelf against the far wall. The old medical camera sat there disguised among medical texts and framed photographs, a relic from the years when I'd conducted remote consultations for rural patients who couldn't travel to San Antonio. Small, unobtrusive, motion-activated, still functional, because I'd never bothered to disconnect it. Elena didn't notice it. She was too focused on her assignment, too confident in her assumed privacy. Bank statements, investment papers, she muttered, photographing pages I'd deliberately left accessible. Trust is a structure with load-bearing walls. Remove too many and the entire building collapses at once. I watched her photograph the trust summary. The envelope labeled Hale Medical Trust in Constance's precise handwriting. Documents Elena had no legitimate reason to touch, let alone photograph. She finished after 11 minutes. Closed drawers, carefully returned items to exact positions, left the room as quietly as she'd entered. I waited 5 minutes before sitting up. The analysis came automatically, the same diagnostic process I'd applied to thousands of cases. Symptom invasion of privacy. Pattern systematic documentation. Target medical competence and financial control. Motive insufficient for independent action. Elena had no personal stake in my mental capacity or trust documents. She was being paid, coerced, or both. The photography was too methodical, too focused. She knew exactly what to document because someone had given her a list. She'd photographed pills I hadn't started taking yet. That wasn't documentation, that was preparation. Building a pharmaceutical narrative before the evidence existed. They were constructing a medical file. But for whom? A doctor, a court, an institution. The question shifted from, what are they doing, to, who are they preparing to show this to? The next afternoon, Lily found me in the living room. A game show played on the television, contestants guessing prices for kitchen appliances, but I wasn't watching. She sat beside me closer than usual, studying my face the way I'd once studied EKG readouts. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "you're not actually confused, are you?" I looked at her, 13 years old. Constance's eyes seeing through her mother's performance with the clarity children have before they learn to accept adult lies. "Why would you think that, sweetheart?" "Because you remember everything." She counted on her fingers. "My spelling tests. My best friend's name you asked about, Sophie, yesterday. My soccer schedule. You remember what day practice is, what time, which field. Mom says you forget things, but you don't. The worst betrayals are committed by people standing close enough to count your heartbeat. Your mom worries." I started, but Lily shook her head. "People who are confused don't pretend to be confused," she said. "And you're not confused. So why is Mom saying you are?" I had two choices: lie to protect her from her mother's deception, or trust her with a truth that would change how she saw her family. "Why do you think I'm pretending?" I asked carefully. She picked at the sofa cushion, not looking at me. "Because confused people don't hide it. They get frustrated, they ask the same questions over and over without knowing they already asked. You don't do any of that. You've been paying attention." "I'm always paying attention." She looked up then, and her expression carried a weight children shouldn't have to carry. "Grandpa, I heard Mom on the phone yesterday. She was talking about a place for you, after Christmas." The room temperature didn't change, but I felt cold anyway. "What kind of place?" "I don't know. She didn't say the name, but she said it would be easier once you were there. That Dad could handle the transfer faster without complications." Lily's voice dropped to a whisper. "Are they trying to send you away?" I reached for her hand. 13 years old, watching her mother orchestrate her grandfather's removal, understanding enough to be frightened, but not enough to know how to stop it. "I won't let that happen," I said. "I won't tell," she said quickly. "I won't tell them we talked. I won't tell them I know." "Lily, I mean it." Her grip tightened. "Whatever you need to do, I won't get in the way. I won't tell Mom anything." I looked at my granddaughter and saw the first ally in a war I hadn't chosen, but could no longer avoid fighting. "Thank you," I said. She nodded once, then returned to her homework, like we'd been discussing geometry instead of family betrayal. But the words echoed "a place for you" after Christmas, less than 3 months. Whatever Simone was building, the fabricated forgetfulness Elena's photograph collection. The suggested medications I didn't need, it had a deadline. The numbers didn't lie the way people did, and at 10:22 p.m. on October 12th, I finally saw the pattern my daughter thought I'd miss. Lily's warning about Christmas had given me a timeline. 3 months to complete whatever documentation Simone needed. 3 months before institutional placement. But documentation required justification, and justification required evidence of something worth controlling. I needed to know what they were really after. The storage room had been my study before Simone redecorated, converting it to boxes of Constance's belongings I hadn't been ready to sort. A single desk lamp still worked. The old iPad I'd used for patient consultations still held its charge. I logged into the trust-linked account I hadn't checked since moving in. Constance had always managed our finances with the precision she brought to hospital administration. After her death, I'd let Simone handle the paperwork, grateful for one less thing to think about through grief. That gratitude had been expensive. The withdrawals appeared in neat chronological order. June $6,200 memo. Household adjustment. July $9,450 memo. Care expense consultation. August $11,000 memo. Medical consultation fee. September $7,800 memo. Cognitive prep consult. Each amount carefully calibrated below the reporting threshold that would trigger automatic review. Each memo vague enough to sound legitimate without providing actual detail. I'd spent 38 years reading cardiac monitors, learning to distinguish normal variation from pathological rhythm. This was an arrhythmia, each individual beat survivable, the cumulative pattern diagnostic of major dysfunction. Cognitive prep consult, I whispered to the empty room. I clicked the memo details. Initials RD. Date September 15th. Description: assessment preparation professional consultation. Russell Dane. An accountant whose name appeared on multiple entries, but whom I'd never met. Never authorized, never heard Simone mention until 2 days ago, when she'd casually said he was helping with the paperwork. I opened my phone, searched the name. Russell Dane, CPA, specializing in estate planning and family trusts. His website showed a professional headshot, 52, thinning hair, nervous smile, the kind of face that appeared trustworthy until you looked closer. In medicine, we call it exsanguination. Death by 1,000 small cuts, each survivable, the total fatal. The withdrawals totaled $34,450 over 4 months. Not enough to collapse the trust. Just enough to test whether I was paying attention. I printed the transaction history. 8 pages of evidence that Simone had been bleeding Constance's carefully constructed trust while simultaneously building a narrative of my incompetence. The test came 2 nights later. Simone announced at breakfast that she'd invited someone to dinner. Russell Dane, Dad. He's the accountant who's been helping us understand the trust paperwork. I thought you'd like to meet him, ask any questions you have. The performance began at 7:05. Russell arrived in a shiny navy suit that didn't quite fit his nervous frame, carrying a leather folder and an expression of professional sympathy. Simone seated him across from me like we were conducting a consultation. "Mr. Hale," he said, extending his hand with practiced warmth. "It's wonderful to finally meet you. Your daughter speaks so highly of you." I shook his hand, noted the slight tremor, noted how his eyes flicked to Grant before answering any question I asked. "Russell's been helping us with some routine adjustments," Grant said, already controlling the conversation. "Just optimizing the trust structure, making sure everything runs smoothly." "What adjustments specifically?" I asked. Russell opened his folder. "Just routine allocations to optimize the trust structure, Mr. Hale. Nothing that changes the fundamental." "Allocations from what to what?" He hesitated. Half a second, but enough. Grant filled the silence. From investment accounts to operational accounts, Dad. Standard procedure. Russell's making sure we're tax efficient, that distributions happen on schedule. Lily pushed her food around her plate, watching. I decided to test them. So the dividends go into the principal account. I used the wrong term deliberately, the kind of mistake someone confused about finance might make. Russell's face relaxed. He chuckled, glanced at Grant, then turned to me with the patronizing gentleness people use on children. Not quite, Mr. Hale. Let me explain it more simply. Think of the trust like a bank account. Money comes in, money goes out, and we just make sure it goes to the right places. Have you ever pretended to be stupid so someone would reveal how they planned to destroy you? Oh, I said, nodding like he'd clarified something profound. That makes sense. Simone smiled. Grant relaxed. Russell continued his simplified explanation of financial concepts I'd understood for 40 years. Lily stared at her grandfather with an expression I couldn't quite read. When Russell prepared to leave, I watched Simone walk him to the door. Watched her glance back to confirm I wasn't following. Watched her pull a silver envelope from her purse and hand it to him with a quiet, "Thank you for coming." Not a handshake, a payment. Russell pocketed the envelope without comment, like this was routine, like he'd done this before. The next night, insomnia drove me downstairs for water. The house was dark, except for the light spilling from Grant's office into the hallway. I stopped outside the partially open door. We just need his signature before anyone outside reviews it. Grant was saying, voice low but clear. He won't understand anyway. Simone's voice tired and certain. We're overthinking this. I'm not worried about him understanding. I'm worried about someone else explaining it to him before we're ready. A pause. Papers rustling. If the medical angle is done by Christmas, Grant continued, we move forward regardless. But I'd prefer cooperation over conflict. Nolan will handle that, Simone said. He's scheduling the evaluation for early November. Once we have the report, Dad's signature becomes automatic. Court-approved conservatorship, medical justification, everything clean. And Russell does what we tell him. He knows what happens if he doesn't. I stood in the dark hallway, glass of water, forgotten. Listening to my daughter and son-in-law discuss the medical certification of my incompetence, like it was a scheduled procedure. Nolan, a name I'd never heard before tonight. A psychiatrist apparently conducting an evaluation. I'd never agreed to producing a report that would justify forcing my signature on documents I hadn't reviewed. The medical angle wasn't separate from the financial bleeding. It was the mechanism that would make the theft legal. I walked back upstairs without the water mind already calculating timelines, evidence, witnesses. Christmas was 9 weeks away. Nolan's evaluation was scheduled for early November, less than 3 weeks. Once that report existed, Simone could petition for conservatorship, claim medical necessity, force signatures on any document she wanted. The conspiracy had a deadline, a structure, and now a name. I needed to call Charles. Charles Whitmore's office door was unlocked at 10:05 a.m. on October 20th, which meant he'd been expecting me. I'd called the morning after, overhearing Grant and Simone discuss Nolan's medical evaluation, my voice steady on the phone. I need to see the trust documents. Charles had simply said, tomorrow, 10 o'clock, like we'd been planning this meeting for weeks. Maybe we had been. Maybe Constance had been planning it for longer than that. The gray Buick borrowed from a neighbor after explaining my daughter had temporarily misplaced my car keys sat in the parking lot of a brick building downtown, wedged between a dental clinic and a real estate agency. The October morning carried that particular Austin heat that makes you question whether fall will ever actually arrive. Charles greeted me at the door of Whitmore and Associates before I'd finished climbing the stairs. 65, silver hair, precisely trimmed, wearing the same careful expression he'd worn at Constance's funeral. I had a feeling you'd come this week, he said, gesturing me inside. Coffee. You knew I was coming before I called. He poured 2 cups from a carafe that looked freshly made, handed me one in a ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Attorney" in faded letters. Constance taught me to watch for certain patterns. I've been watching. The Hale Medical Trust file sat open on his dark wood desk, not pulled from storage, open like he'd been reviewing it recently. Tab markers protruded from sections labeled Trustee Authority Succession Provisions, Charitable Obligations. "How long have you been monitoring?" I asked. Charles settled into his chair. "Since June. The day you called from the San Antonio house and said something felt wrong about Simone's urgency to sell. You thought it was grief making you paranoid. I thought it was Constance's husband finally seeing what Constance saw." He slid the thick folder across the desk, open to a page marked with a yellow tab. "See this signature?" His finger tapped the bottom of a densely worded document. "That's you. Primary controller, present tense. Not past. Not contingent. Present." I looked at my own signature dated 3 years ago, when Constance had insisted on updating the trust structure. Her handwriting appeared in the margins, notes about distribution schedules, charitable allocations, succession criteria. "Then why does it feel like I control nothing?" I asked. "Because someone is working very hard to make you feel that way." Charles turned several pages, his movements deliberate. Legal power and emotional manipulation operate in different spaces. One doesn't negate the other, it just makes the manipulation harder to see. Legal documents are skeletal structures. They reveal the shape of power when emotional flesh is stripped away. He pointed to a section titled Successor Trustee Designation. Simone is designated as successor trustee under 3 conditions: only incapacity, death, or voluntary transfer of authority. His voice carried the patient precision of someone explaining a diagnosis. "None of those conditions are currently met. You're 72 sharp as you were at 50, and you haven't transferred anything. And Grant has no authority whatsoever. He's not even mentioned in these documents." Constance was very specific about that. I thought about Grant's confident explanations of financial procedures, his casual discussions with Russell about trust allocations, the way he spoke about my assets, like they were already his to manage. "But they've been making financial decisions," I said. "Withdrawals, consultations, hiring accountants I never approved." "Not legally," Charles said. "Which is why they need something from you that you haven't given them yet. My signature on an authorization that would make their previous actions retroactively legitimate and their future actions automatic." I described the pattern that had emerged over 4 months. The coffee restrictions and medication management. Elena photographing trust documents while I pretended to sleep. The car keys removed based on fabricated forgetfulness. Russell's dinner theater performance. The overheard conversation about Nolan conducting a medical evaluation I'd never agreed to. Charles took notes in precise handwriting, asking occasional questions about dates and specific conversations. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me with an expression I'd seen on senior physicians reviewing a complex case. "The pattern suggests coordinated effort to create appearance of incompetence while maintaining veneer of family care," he said. "Medical paternalism providing cover for financial manipulation. The car keys aren't about safety, they're about documentation. Evidence of decline to show whoever reviews the medical evaluation. There's a particular relief in hearing someone say, 'They're lying to you,' when you've been telling yourself it's all in your head." "Who is Nolan?" I asked. "Dr. Nolan Pierce, psychiatrist. Specializes in geriatric competency evaluations for trust and estate cases." Charles's mouth tightened. "He's legitimate, well-credentialed, and expensive. The kind of expert whose reports carry weight in conservatorship proceedings. Simone scheduled an evaluation without telling me, because if you knew, you'd refuse. And refusal looks like resistance to medical care, which feeds the incompetence narrative." He opened his laptop, rotated the screen toward me. "But there's something else. Something I discovered 3 days ago." The screen showed a trust monitoring system real-time tracking of account activity pending transactions authorization requests. "The trust has automatic oversight protocols Constance insisted on," Charles explained. Certain actions trigger notification to the attorney of record. 2 weeks ago, on October 6th, I received an alert. He pointed to a line highlighted in yellow. Pending asset reallocation request submitted. October 6th, 2025. 2:47 p.m. initiated by Russell Dane CPA on behalf of family representative, status awaiting primary trustee authorization. They submitted a request before the car keys, I said. Before Russell came to dinner, before I overheard anything about Nolan. Which means the timeline was already in motion. October 6th was the start, not the middle. Charles's expression carried the gravity of a physician about to deliver difficult news. The request itself isn't illegal. People reallocate trust assets for legitimate reasons all the time. But the timing, the method, the pattern around it. He leaned forward, tapping the screen. This is what I don't like. The pending request sat there in digital clarity, proof that while I'd been grieving and trusting and trying to adapt to life without Constance, my daughter had been building a structure to dismantle everything my wife had created. What is she trying to move? I asked. Charles's pause lasted 2 seconds too long. How much do you know about the full trust structure? $24 million. That's what Constance and I had built over 45 years, and what my daughter was quietly dismantling in 45 days. Not much, I said, answering Charles's question about my knowledge of the trust structure. Constance handled the details. I just worked. Then let me show you what your work built. Charles unfolded a detailed asset breakdown across his desk, the kind of comprehensive financial map that transforms abstract numbers into concrete architecture. His finger traced each line as he spoke. Total trust value $24 million, give or take market fluctuations. He pointed to the first section. Texas Surgical Center equity stake $8.2 million. You and 3 partners bought majority ownership in 1998. Your share appreciated significantly. I remembered the investment. Constance had insisted we diversify beyond just my salary, that surgical skills alone wouldn't fund retirement or legacy. Diversified investment portfolio, $9.5 million. Conservative allocation bonds, index funds, some pharmaceutical stocks that performed well. 45 years of surgical practice condensed to a spreadsheet with clean columns and precise figures. Hale Residential Holdings, LLC, $3.1 million in property holdings. Property, I asked. We'll get to that. Charles moved his finger to the bottom line, and his voice softened. And this Hale Margaret Cardiac Relief Fund. $3.2 million. Established 2018. My chest tightened seeing Constance's name rendered in black ink on white paper, reduced to asset allocation and balance sheets. The fund had been her final project before the stroke. She'd spent months researching how many cardiac patients went untreated because insurance denied coverage or deductibles exceeded savings. Spent evenings calculating how much we could afford to give without jeopardizing our own stability. We name it after both of us, she'd said, insisting I be included despite my protests that it was her vision, her passion, her moral clarity. Money that saves lives shouldn't gather dust in an account, Everett. It should do what you've spent your life doing, keeping hearts beating. The fund had helped 43 patients in 6 years. I knew because I'd read every application, reviewed every case, imagined myself in the operating room, performing the procedures these strangers desperately needed. Constance insisted we name it after both of us, I said quietly. She said money that saves lives shouldn't gather dust. The fund has helped 43 patients, Charles confirmed. Valve replacements, bypass surgeries, ablations. People who would have died without it. And Simone wants to reallocate it. Yes, seeing your dead wife's name on a fund, helping strangers survive. Then watching your child try to empty it teaches you things about love and greed you never wanted to learn. Charles rotated his laptop back toward me, pulling up the detailed reallocation request. Asset reallocation, $3.8 million. Source mixed trust components, including portions of the investment portfolio, surgical center distributions, and, he paused, 20% of the cardiac relief fund. The number sat on the screen in clinical precision. $3.8 million. Not the full $24 million, but substantial. A life-changing amount. A legacy-destroying amount. The request was submitted October 6th through your household financial representative, Russell Dane. Expedited processing was requested through a bank contact. If you sign the authorization, Grant Mercer becomes managing authority over the reallocated portion. I read the document summary. Management transition. Simplified oversight. Operational efficiency. The language was designed to sound reasonable, procedural, boring. $3.8 million, I said. Not the full trust, but a gateway. Charles leaned back in his chair. Exactly. If you sign this, Grant becomes managing authority over everything they move. And once that precedent exists, the next request becomes easier to justify. Over what I built over Constance's fund, over everything they designate for reallocation. And here's what concerns me most. He pointed to a footnote in the request. The language includes provisions for automatic approval of subsequent reallocations up to 40% of the initially transferred amount. Sign this once and they can move another $1.5 million without asking again. The architecture of theft was more sophisticated than I'd realized. They're not stealing everything at once. I said, the pattern suddenly clear. Too visible, too risky. Precisely. They're testing if you'll notice the first cut. If you sign without questioning, without reading carefully, without understanding it, establishes precedent. Charles tapped the screen. Next request will be $6 million, then 8. Death by increment, not sudden theft. In cardiology, we use gateway procedures, small interventions testing if the patient can tolerate larger ones, building toward the operation that changes everything. The medical evaluation, I said, Nolan's report, would provide justification for why you signed without full understanding. Not your fault you were experiencing cognitive decline, couldn't process complex financial decisions, needed family assistance. The signature becomes evidence of the very incompetence they're documenting. And if I refuse to sign, they escalate. Push harder for the medical evaluation, build the incompetence case more aggressively, potentially petition for emergency conservatorship, citing your refusal to accept necessary help. Charles's voice carried the weight of experience. Either way, they believe they win. Sign and they get the money. Refuse and they get the incompetence narrative. I looked at the spreadsheet again. $24 million. Surgical center equity from decades of skill. Investment returns from Constance's careful planning. Property holdings I apparently didn't fully understand. And a charitable fund that kept hearts beating when insurance companies said no. What did Constance tell you? I asked. When she revised the trust 6 months before her stroke. What did she say? Charles was quiet for a moment. She said if Simone ever tried to access the trust inappropriately, I should make sure you knew exactly what you were fighting for. Not just money, legacy values, the difference between wealth that serves and wealth that corrupts. He closed the laptop with deliberate finality. They think you're too old, too tired, too grief-stricken to fight. They're betting you won't read documents carefully, won't understand the implications, won't challenge family. They're testing whether you'll stop them. I thought about the coffee restrictions, the car keys, the patronizing medication explanations, Russell's silver envelope payment, Elena's photograph collection. Every small humiliation designed to convince me I was incompetent while they systematically dismantled what Constance and I had built. They're wrong, I said. Then we need to prove it. But carefully, strategically. We can't just refuse the request, we need to understand the full scope of what they're planning. Charles pulled another document from the file. Starting with this Hale Residential Holdings LLC, $3.1 million in property. Do you know what that LLC owns? The house where my daughter told me I ate for free, the house I'd been apologizing for occupying, belonged to me. I don't know what property the LLC owns, I said, answering Charles's question. Constance handled those details. Charles shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly. Let me ask you something else. The house in Austin where you're currently living, whose name is on the deed. Simone and Grant bought it in 2019, I said. Nice neighborhood, good schools for Lily. I moved in last year after Constance died. They insisted I shouldn't be alone. Charles opened a different desk drawer, removed a thick property file marked with a blue tab. Actually, no, they didn't. He slid a document across the desk. Travis County Property Deed, recorded March 14th, 2019. The official seal embossed in the corner, that particular shade of government blue that makes documents look authoritative and permanent. Property address, 4847 Cliffside Drive, Austin, Texas. I stared at the address. That was Simone's house. The house with the walnut dining table where she'd served me rosemary chicken and humiliation. The house where I'd been apologizing for existing. Purchaser Hale Residential Holdings, LLC. Not Simone Mercer. Not Grant Mercer. Not even joint ownership. Hale Residential Holdings. This is Simone's address, I said slowly. But it says, Hale Residential Holdings, an LLC your wife created in 2017 as a subsidiary of the Medical Trust for Property Acquisition and Management. Charles tapped the purchase price line. $485,000 paid from the trust investment portfolio. Constance bought Simone's house. Your trust did. Simone lives there, but she doesn't own it. Never has. I read the document again slower this time, looking for the error or addendum that would make this make sense. But property deeds don't lie the way people do. They told me they bought it, I said. Simone showed me photos when they were house hunting, talked about mortgage rates, closing costs. I'm sure she did. Charles pulled another document from the file. Here's the family occupancy agreement signed the same day, March 14th, 2019. Simone Mercer and Grant Mercer occupants, not owners, occupants. The agreement was 2 pages of legal language outlining maintenance responsibilities, utility obligations, and standard occupancy terms. The rent line read, family arrangement, no monetary exchange. At the bottom, a clause in bold, occupancy terminates at trust administrator's discretion. They're tenants, I said. Correct. They never told me. The words came out flat, but inside something was shifting. A foundation I thought had crumbled was actually still there, just hidden under debris. I'd been too grief-stricken to move. I assume not, Charles said. Because at the November dinner, what did Simone say when you asked about the bank envelope? I remembered her exact words. You don't even pay for anything here anymore. She lied, Charles said simply. What does it mean when your daughter takes away your car keys inside a house she doesn't own, serving you dinner bought with money she can't access? Why would Constance structure it this way? I asked. Why not just give them the house outright? We could afford it. Why the LALC, the occupancy agreement, all this complexity? Charles leaned back, choosing his words carefully. Estate planning in 2017 and 2019 favored trust-owned property for several reasons. Protection from creditors. Protection from potential divorce claims. Housing security without an outright gift that triggers tax complications. He paused. And control. Constance wanted Simone to have secure housing, but she wanted the trust to maintain legal authority. She suspected Simone needed guardrails even then. Constance saw many things, Charles said quietly. Some she shared with me. Some she kept private. But yes, I believe she wanted certain protections in place. I thought about the trust revisions Constance had insisted on 6 months before her stroke. The sealed documents Charles had mentioned. The abuse protection clauses I still hadn't fully reviewed. My wife had been building a legal fortress while I'd been focused on catheterization procedures and patient consultations. She'd seen something in our daughter that I'd dismissed as normal adult independence. And she'd been right. 20 minutes later, I stood in the parking lot, beside the borrowed Buick gray October sky, threatening rain that wouldn't quite arrive. Charles had walked me out, hands in his pockets, looking more like a friend delivering difficult news than an attorney executing strategy. "Don't tell her you know," he said. "Not yet. You want me to keep living there pretending? I want to see what they do when they think you're powerless." Charles watched a car pull out of the dental clinic lot across the street. "If you confront Simone now, she'll adjust. Change tactics. Maybe accelerate the medical evaluation, push harder for conservatorship. But if she believes you don't know about the trust structure, the property ownership, the full scope of what she's attempting, she'll keep building evidence that I can use against her." Precisely. In surgery, the moment you know what's wrong isn't always the moment you cut. Sometimes you wait, let the condition reveal itself fully, then strike with precision. I looked back at the brick office building, then in the direction of the house on Cliffside Drive. The house where Simone told me I contributed nothing. The house where Elena photographed my trust documents. The house where Lily overheard plans for my institutional placement. The house that belonged to me. "I want to know how far they'll go," I said, "inside a house they don't own." Charles nodded slowly. "That means watching them try to destroy you, documenting false incompetence, pushing for medical evaluations you don't need, creating evidence of decline that doesn't exist. Can you do that?" I thought about decades of cardiac diagnoses, patients presenting with symptoms that seemed obvious until you looked closer and found the real pathology hiding underneath. The discipline of observation before intervention. The patience required to let a condition reveal its full architecture before planning treatment. "I diagnosed hearts for 38 years, I said. "I know how to wait for the truth to show itself completely before I operate." "Good." Charles extended his hand. "Then we let them think they're winning. We document everything. And when they finally put the real paperwork in front of you, the transfer authorization, the conservatorship petition, whatever mechanism they're building toward, we'll have enough evidence to stop them permanently." I shook his hand, feeling the shift from victim to strategist, from confused elderly father to man with resources and knowledge his daughter didn't realize he possessed. I drove back toward Cliffside Drive, toward the house I legally owned, where I would eat dinner at a table I technically controlled, while my daughter explained my medication to me in a bedroom that existed at my discretion. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the strategy. The hardest role I ever played wasn't surgeon. It was pretending to be the helpless old man my daughter needed me to be. I sat in the borrowed Buick outside Charles's office, hands on the steering wheel, the trust documents in a manila folder on the passenger seat. Evidence. Proof. Legal ammunition I could use right now. I could drive to Cliffside Drive and confront Simone. Show her the deed proving she lived in a house she didn't own. Watch her face as 45 days of manipulation collapsed. It would feel satisfying for approximately 10 minutes. Then she'd deny everything. Blame miscommunication. Retreat temporarily, regroup with better lawyers, come back with a strategy I wouldn't see. But if I let her believe I was confused, deteriorating, helpless, she'd keep going. Keep creating evidence I could document and use when it mattered. They needed to put the real transfer authorization in front of me. I needed them to believe I'd sign it. I opened the glove compartment, found Constance's Mont Blanc fountain pen, wedged behind the owner's manual. Black lacquer with gold trim, the weight announcing itself in my hand. She'd given it to me on our 30th anniversary for signing documents that mattered. Now I'd use it for deception. I slipped the pen into my jacket pocket. Every signature from this moment forward would be a strategic weapon, not surrender. If they needed a helpless old man, I'd give them one they'd never forget underestimating. 2 days later, October 22nd, evening light. Fading through kitchen windows, Simone placed papers on the table. "Just some routine forms, Dad." False brightness in her voice. "Medical records release and updated insurance beneficiary designations." She was testing. Charles had confirmed these were harmless when I'd called that afternoon. "She's checking if you'll sign without reading," he'd said. "Then I'll read," I'd answered, slowly. I picked up the first form, put on my reading glasses with deliberate care. held the paper at arm's length. This one. What does beneficiary designation mean again? Simone glanced at Grant near the counter. I caught the look quick, assessing, satisfied. It just means who gets notified, Grant said. Standard stuff. I nodded, slowly moved to the second page. Should I read all of this? It's quite long. You can if you want, Simone said, voice softening into false sympathy. But it's really just technical language. Have you ever had to pretend to be less than you are, so someone would reveal how much less they thought of you? I pulled Constance's pen from my jacket pocket, unscrewed the cap with fingers moving slightly slower than necessary. Blue ink or black, does it matter for legal forms? Grant's expression flickered, not quite a smile, but close. Either is fine, sweetheart, Simone said. Sweetheart. An endearment she hadn't used since childhood deployed now, like medicine hiding its purpose. Just sign wherever you see the X. I positioned the pen, then paused. And the date October comes before 22, right? Or is it the other way? Month first, then day, Simone said, patience exaggerated. 10/22/2025. I wrote it slowly, checking each number like solving a complex equation rather than writing a date I'd written hundreds of times. In cardiology, we use stress tests, deliberate controlled strain to reveal heart defects invisible at rest. This was my stress test, and they were failing spectacularly. The signature took longer than it should have. I drew each letter with careful precision, not shaky, but slow. Uncertain, like remembering something once known. I moved to the second form. Asked if I needed to initial every page. Wondered aloud whether my middle name was required. Cleaned my reading glasses unnecessarily. Simone's voice stayed syrup-sweet triumph underneath. Grant stopped pretending to check his phone. He was watching now, cataloging every hesitation, every simple question. I signed the final form with exaggerated care, set the pen down, looked up at Simone like a child seeking approval. Did I do that right? Should I have read it more carefully? You did perfectly, Dad. She gathered the papers. See how easy that was, huh? It was easy, I agreed. Thank you for helping me understand. I stood slowly, deliberately, leaving the Mont Blanc on the table. Another small detail, they'd notice another data point in the incompetence narrative. Walking toward my bedroom, I moved just slightly slower than necessary. Not shuffling, that would be theatrical, just careful gait. Someone who might need assistance. Someone who definitely needed protection from complex financial decisions. Behind me, Grant's voice came as a whisper pitched just loud enough to carry. See, he murmured to Simone. This won't be hard. I continued down the hallway, maintaining the slow pace, giving no indication I'd heard. But I had. Every word. Every implication. The bait had worked. Now they believed I'd sign anything placed in front of me. Believed the real transfer documents would be just as easy to obtain. In my bedroom door closed, I retrieved the pen I'd deliberately left behind, walked back to get it, apologizing for forgetfulness, and sat on the bed. Grant's confidence meant they'd accelerated their timeline. The real documents would come soon. Days, maybe. Certainly before the Nolan evaluation I still hadn't been told about officially. I just needed to wait. Watch. Let them think they were winning while I documented every step of their victory march toward exposure. My 13-year-old granddaughter became a witness to conspiracy the night she came to my room holding evidence her mother didn't know existed. The real documents didn't come in 3 days. They came in 3 hours, not on paper, but in audio recorded by a child who understood more than anyone realized. October 25th, 9:12 p.m. The knock on my bedroom door was soft, anxious. Lily stood in the hallway, eyes wide, phone clutched in both hands like it might explode. "Grandpa," she whispered, glancing back toward the stairs. "I recorded something. I think you should hear it." She slipped inside, closed the door carefully. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled up an audio file, pressed play. The sound quality was muffled, phone in pocket maybe, or hidden under papers. But the voices were clear enough. Simone's voice, that professional tone she used for hospital fundraising calls. "He'll be declared incompetent before Christmas if Nolan does his part." Grant's reply, casual, confident. Good. Then the transfer becomes simple. Just needs his signature first. Simone again. The evaluation is November 5th. Report should be finalized within a week. Then we present the authorization papers while he's still. The recording cut off. Movement, probably. Lily extracting the phone, leaving the room before they noticed. I looked at my granddaughter. When did you record this? Tonight. About an hour ago. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. I went to get a book from the office shelf. They didn't know I was there. I wasn't trying to spy, once I heard what they were saying, I couldn't not record it. You did the right thing. Are they really trying to put you somewhere? The question came out small, frightened. Like a home. I could have lied. Protected her from the truth about her parents. But Lily had already protected me. The least I owed her was honesty. They're trying, I said, but I'm not going to let that happen. What are you going to do? Stop them. But I need you to stay safe. Don't let them know you're aware. Don't put yourself in danger trying to help me. Can you do that? I won't tell them I know. I promise. She handed me the phone. Do you want to keep this, or should I send it to you? Send it to my email. Then delete it from your phone just to be safe. She nodded, fingers moving quickly across the screen. My phone buzzed 30 seconds later, audio file attached to a message that just said, "Love you, Grandpa." Thank you, I said. You're braver than you know. After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed, playing the recording 3 more times. First, concrete audio evidence linking all the conspirators. Simone's voice stating the incompetence timeline. Grant confirming the signature strategy. And a name I'd only heard once before, Nolan. Children see truth adults pretend to miss. They haven't learned yet that love requires selective blindness. I couldn't sleep. 1:08 a.m. I sat at the small desk in the corner of my bedroom lamp, casting yellow light across a blank notebook I'd found in the closet. 40 years of medical training had taught me one thing. You can't treat what you don't understand. And you can't understand complex pathology until you map it. I drew a diagram. Not a family tree, a circulatory system. Simone, emotional pressure, main artery. She provided the narrative, the performance, the family justification for control. Grant, financial strategy, coronary circulation. He managed Russell, coordinated with the bank, contact, structured the legal mechanisms. Russell Dane, transactions, capillaries. Small withdrawals just under thresholds, bleeding the trust in increments. Elena Rodriguez, surveillance, lymphatic system. Photographing documents, monitoring behavior, collecting evidence of fabricated decline. Nolan Pierce, incompetence certification, cardiac valve. He controlled whether the entire system could function. Marcy Bell at the bank, transfer mechanism, ventricle. She expedited processing, pushed paperwork through channels. I stared at the diagram. They weren't individual criminals. They were an integrated system. Each person a vessel. Together they formed something lethal. Every disease has a diagnostic signature, the pattern that separates random symptoms from systemic pathology. I circled Nolan's name repeatedly. He was the only piece I hadn't observed directly. And he was critical without the psychiatric evaluation, without the incompetence certification. They couldn't force institutional placement, couldn't justify signature coercion, couldn't present medical necessity as legal cover, which meant I needed to let them take me to him. Let them think I was compliant, cooperative, deteriorating exactly as they'd documented. Let Nolan perform his evaluation, create his fraudulent diagnosis, build evidence I could later use to destroy not just the conspiracy, but his professional license. I wrote in the margin, "Meet the doctor, let him fabricate." Medical fraud wasn't just grounds for criminal prosecution. It invalidated everything the evaluation, any court proceedings based on it, any documents signed under its influence. Nolan Pierce thought he was providing the key to unlock a $24 million trust. He was actually constructing the evidence that would dismantle the entire conspiracy. November 1st. 6 days after Lily's recording. Dinner at the walnut table, rosemary chicken again. Simone placed a white appointment card in front of me, the kind medical offices print with appointment reminders. "I've scheduled a checkup for you, Dad," she said, voice carrying that false brightness. "With Dr. Pierce, very kind psychiatrist who specializes in helping people after loss." I picked up the card, let my hand move slightly slower than necessary. "A psychiatrist, do I need that?" "Just a mental health checkup," she smiled. "After Mom died, it's normal to struggle. Dr. Pierce helps people process grief. Many people your age don't realize when they're declining," Grant added. "It's preventive. Responsible." Lily watched silently, fork barely moving. I read the card. "Dr. Nolan Pierce, MD, Psychiatric Evaluation. November 5th, 2025, 2 p.m. Westlake Hills Clinic." At the bottom, a signature authorizing the appointment, NP. Nolan Pierce's initials. The same NP that had appeared on Russell's withdrawal memo from September. The one labeled Cognitive Prep Consult. 2 months ago. They'd been planning this since September. "November 5th, I said slowly. "That's soon." "No time like the present." Simone tucked the card away. "I'll drive you. Make sure you don't get confused about the location." I nodded, returning to my dinner like the appointment was nothing more than routine. But in my pocket, my phone held Lily's recording. In my bedroom, a diagram mapped every conspirator. And in 4 days, I'd meet the doctor who thought he was certifying my incompetence while I documented his fraud. I'd spent 38 years watching doctors diagnose patients. Now I was watching one fabricate a diagnosis I didn't have. The September involvement, the 2 months of planning the cognitive prep consult, all of it led to November 5th at 1:55 p.m. when Simone pulled into the parking lot of a private clinic in Westlake Hills, the kind of upscale Austin suburb where medical offices looked more like spas than hospitals. Light blue walls, gray leather chairs, the faint chemical smell of medical-grade disinfectant trying to hide behind lavender diffusers. A Texas landscape painting hanging slightly askew, the kind of generic art that filled waiting rooms across the state. Simone approached the reception desk and I watched the performance begin. "Hi, Monica," she said warmly, smiling at the receptionist like greeting an old friend. "We're here for the 2 o'clock. "Of course, Ms. Mercer." The woman Monica apparently returned the smile. "Dr. Pierce will be right with you." Simone had told me this was a newly found psychiatrist. A recommendation from someone at the hospital fundraising office. A doctor who specialized in helping elderly patients process grief after loss. But she knew the receptionist's name. Greeted her with the casual familiarity of established routine. This wasn't a new appointment. This was a relationship. Dr. Nolan Pierce emerged from the hallway at precisely 2 o'clock. 45, maybe 46, with the kind of practiced warmth that came from years of telling people what they wanted to hear. Too comfortable in his clinic, moving through the space like he owned not just the practice, but everyone's assumptions about his expertise. He shook Simone's hand first, not mine, hers, and his eyes lingered on her just slightly longer than professional courtesy warranted. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "good to see you. Thank you for fitting us in, Dr. Pierce." Simone's voice carried gratitude that felt rehearsed. "Of course." Then, as if remembering I existed, he turned to me, extended his hand. "Mr. Hale, thank you for coming in today." I shook his hand, maintained the slower movements I'd been performing for weeks. "My daughter said you could help." "I certainly hope so." He led us down a hallway to an examination room. Birch desk, 2 chairs facing it, one behind. Herman Miller office chairs, expensive, the kind hospitals bought when someone donated money earmarked for administrative comfort. Abstract art on cream walls. Tall windows overlooking a landscaped courtyard. Nolan gestured to the chairs facing the desk, addressed Simone again before me. "Would you like to stay during the evaluation? Family perspective can be helpful in these assessments." "If that's okay," Simone said, settling into the chair beside mine. "Absolutely. Watching your profession's ethics violated by someone wearing the same white coat you wore for decades creates a very particular species of rage." Nolan opened a file, physical, not digital, I noted. and began the standard cognitive assessment questions. The kind of screening tool every medical student learned, designed to catch dementia, stroke damage, serious cognitive impairment. "Can you tell me what day it is today, Mr. Hale?" I paused deliberately, as if searching my memory. Let 3 seconds pass. "November 5th, Tuesday." He wrote in the file. Not a check mark. Full sentences. Far more notation than my correct answer warranted. "And who is the current president?" Another pause. "Biden, Joe Biden." More extensive writing. "I'm going to give you 3 words to remember. I'll ask you to repeat them in a few minutes. The words are apple, table, penny. Can you repeat those back to me? Apple, table, penny. Good. Now can you count backward from 100 by sevens? I'd taught medical residents this test. Knew it was designed to assess working memory and concentration. Knew that most cognitively intact people could do it without significant difficulty. 100, I said slowly. 93, 86, 79, 72. I continued to 65 before he stopped me nodding, writing more sentences than my performance justified. Every answer correct. Every response appropriate. And he was documenting it like I'd failed. Then he turned to Simone. "Ms. Mercer, have you noticed any changes in your father's daily functioning?" This was the moment. The fabrication I'd been waiting for. "He forgets his medication," Simone said, voice carrying practiced concern. "Last week I found the stove on twice after he'd walked away. He gets confused about what time of day it is, needs reminders for appointments. I hadn't used the stove in weeks. Simone managed my medication in that blue organizer specifically so she could claim I needed help, and I'd never missed an appointment in my life until she took my car keys. But I didn't refute, didn't correct. Just sat there performing the role of confused elderly patient, while my daughter lied to a doctor who pretended to believe her. If you've ever had to sit silent while someone documented lies about your mind, you know that keeping your face neutral requires every ounce of surgical discipline you ever learned. Nolan recorded every claim as medical fact. No verification, no independent assessment. Just Simone's fabricated testimony transcribed into a clinical file that would carry the weight of professional psychiatric evaluation. "Does he manage his own finances?" Nolan asked. "We've had to take over most of that," Simone said. "The trust paperwork is too complex. He gets overwhelmed. Lies built on lies recorded as diagnosis." Near the end of the examination, Nolan excused himself. "Let me grab a consent form. One moment." He stood, left the room door closing most of the way, but not latching. Simone pulled out her phone, checking messages. Not watching me. I let my gaze drift to Nolan's desk, to the computer monitor angled toward his chair screen, still active. A document was open. Word processor. I could see the tab at the top of the window. Hale_Everett_cognitive decline_draft. My eyes moved to the visible text. Conclusion paragraph partially visible. Patient exhibits early-stage cognitive decline, affecting capacity for independent financial judgment. Recommend supervised management of complex financial decisions. Then I saw it. Bottom right corner of the window. Document properties visible in the status bar. Created October 29th, 2025, 4:17 p.m. October 29th. A week ago. 7 days before this examination. 7 days before Nolan Pierce ever met me. The diagnosis had been written before the doctor examined the patient. Nolan returned with papers and I shifted my gaze away from the screen, like I'd been staring at nothing in particular. But I'd seen enough. The cognitive decline conclusion wasn't based on today's assessment. It had been drafted a week ago, ready to be finalized after this performance made it look legitimate. Medical fraud. Professional misconduct. Evidence that would invalidate not just the report, but Nolan's license to practice. The printer was still running when the assistant walked in. The examination had ended moments ago, Nolan's fraudulent diagnosis safely hidden on his computer screen. But the metadata, created October 29th, 2025, 4:17 p.m., had burned itself into my memory. Someone had built this fraud a week before meeting me, and now I needed to prove it. The assistant moved with the efficient rhythm of someone who'd made this trip dozens of times. Today, collect papers from the printer. Straighten stack, return to filing. Young, maybe 28, wearing scrubs, and the harried expression of medical support staff everywhere. But her shoe caught the chair leg. The papers scattered, and one page landed face up at my feet. Document properties visible in the header printed in that small gray font most people never notice. File name: Hale _Everett _cognitive decline _draft. Created October 29th, 2025 4:17 p.m. Modified November 5th, 2025 1:52 p.m. 7 days between creation and today's modification. 7 days between writing the conclusion and conducting the examination that supposedly justified it. I'm so sorry, Dr. Hale. The assistant bent quickly, gathering pages. These are confidential, I shouldn't have. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check a message, angled it down. The camera shutter sound disguised as a text notification. No harm done, I said, bending slowly to help gather the papers. Here, let me help with those. She collected them quickly, professionally flustered, disappeared back down the hallway. I had the photograph. Irrefutable evidence that the psychiatric evaluation report existed before the examination. Not a draft template, a completed conclusion with my name dated a week before Nolan Pierce ever met me. Simone appeared in the doorway, purse over her shoulder, performing solicitous concern. Dad, I know this feels invasive. She touched my arm, the gesture calculated for any staff who might be watching. But Dr. Pierce is excellent. We'll have clarity soon, and then we can get you the support you need. Clarity. Support. Words that meant control and institutional placement. When will we know the results? I asked, maintaining the slower speech pattern. Dr. Pierce will have the report finalized within a few days. Then we can discuss next steps. Next steps. The authorization papers. The signature they needed before Christmas. We walked toward the exit, Simone's hand hovering near my elbow like I might stumble. In the hallway, Nolan emerged from his office, holding a gray envelope I'd seen Simone carrying when we arrived. Their eyes met. Brief exchange practiced. Simone handed him the envelope with a movement so casual it would have looked like nothing to anyone not watching for it. Thursday, Nolan said quietly. Same arrangement. Of course, Simone replied. Payment. Schedule. Routine transaction disguised as professional courtesy. How many times had I watched colleagues cut corners under pressure? But this wasn't negligence. This was architecture. Someone had built this fraud with precision, and now I held the blueprint. Simone drove me back to Cliffside Drive, talking about stopping for groceries, whether I wanted anything special for dinner, the kind of mundane conversation that pretended today had been routine medical care instead of conspiracy. I told her I needed to rest, went to my bedroom, closed the door, waited 5 minutes, then walked to the kitchen, took the keys to the neighbor's Buick I'd borrowed weeks ago when they'd left town, drove back to Westlake Hills. The clinic's parking structure was 3 levels concrete and fluorescent lights, and the echo of engines in enclosed space. I positioned the car on level 2 with a view of the elevator bank engine running, prepared to wait. 40 minutes. Then the elevator chimed. Simone emerged, walking with purpose toward the visitor section where her car was parked. But she didn't go to her car. She walked to a black BMW license plate I'd memorized from the clinic directory, Nolan's reserved spot. He was leaning against the driver's door, tie-loosened jacket over his arm, waiting for her. Their body language transformed the moment they thought no one was watching. I'd counseled hundreds of cardiac patients through devastating diagnoses. I'd learned to compartmentalize grief, to separate the clinical from the personal. But watching your daughter orchestrate your destruction requires a different kind of detachment, one I was still learning. Nolan's hand found the small of Simone's back. Not a professional touch. Possessive. Familiar. The kind of contact that spoke to months, maybe years of intimacy. Simone's fingers trailed along his lapel, adjusting something that didn't need adjusting. Lingering. Then the kiss. Not a peck. Not a friendly goodbye. The kind of kiss that lasted too long, that included his other hand cupping her face, that made the parking garage feel like an invasion of privacy I was deliberately witnessing. They spoke quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the body language. The gray envelope sat visible on his passenger seat through the BMW window. This wasn't just professional conspiracy. This was an affair. Simone wasn't simply paying Nolan to fabricate a diagnosis. She was leveraging a relationship to secure an inheritance. Every interaction reframed. The way he'd greeted her first at the clinic. The extended eye contact. The deference to her comfort over mine. The willingness to commit medical fraud that would destroy his career if exposed. He wasn't just a corrupt psychiatrist. He was my daughter's lover, willing to certify my incompetence to help her steal what Constance and I had built. They separated. Simone walked to her car. Nolan drove away in the opposite direction. I waited until both vehicles disappeared before pulling out my phone. Text to Charles. Find what connects Simone to Nolan Pierce. Personal, not professional. Need full background. His reply came 30 seconds later. On it. I started the engine, beginning to back out, when my phone vibrated again. Email notification. Sender Whitmore and Associates, Estate Services Division. Subject: time delayed message per Mrs. Hale's instructions. I stopped the car, stared at the screen. The email body was brief. Mr. Hale, pair instructions left by Mrs. Constance Hale. The attached letter was to be delivered to you exactly 12 months after her passing. Today marks that anniversary. The contents are sealed and were not disclosed to this office. Margaret Simmons, Estate Administrator. Attachment letter _ Everett _ final.pdf. Constance had died March 18th, 2024. Today was November 5th, 2025. Not quite 12 months, but close enough that the automated system had triggered. My wife had left me a letter, scheduled to arrive exactly when I'd need it most. Exactly when her daughter's conspiracy would be reaching its critical point. Whatever Constance had wanted me to know, she'd planned for me to discover it now. Charles Whitmore's voice on the phone carried an urgency I hadn't heard in 40 years of friendship. Constance's time-delayed letter had arrived the night before, but I hadn't opened it. Couldn't. Not until I understood what my wife had been trying to tell me from beyond death. Come to the office, Charles had said that morning. Now, there's something you need to see before you read that letter. November 7th, 9:20 a.m. Charles's office looked the same as always. Dark wood leather chairs, law books organized by precedent. But on his desk sat an ivory envelope, unsealed, older than the digital letter I'd received. Constance gave me this 2 months before she died, Charles said, touching the envelope like it might disintegrate. She made me promise to open it only if specific conditions were met. Financial manipulation of the trust. Medical coercion. Any attempt to declare you incompetent for gain. He slid the envelope across the desk. My name in Constance's handwriting, that precise script she'd developed over 30 years of hospital administration. I opened it. 2 pages, handwritten. Dated January 15th, 2024, 2 months before her stroke. Everett, it began. If you're reading this, our daughter has done what I feared she would. My hands steadied themselves the way they had before every surgery. Clinical detachment. Read the diagnosis before planning treatment. I've noticed Simone asking too many questions about the trust structure. Not curious questions, calculating ones. How much? When? What happens if you become incapacitated? She thinks I don't notice, but I spent 3 decades managing hospital budgets. I recognize people inventorying assets that aren't theirs. The next paragraph hit harder. Last Thanksgiving, Grant photographed page 3 of the trust summary. I saw him do it. He waited until you were in the kitchen, pulled out his phone, took 3 photos of the distribution schedule. I pretended not to notice because I wanted to see what they'd do next. Thanksgiving 2023. Almost 2 years ago. Before Constance died. Before I moved in with Simone. Before any of this became visible. The letter continued. I know what you're thinking. That I should have said something. That I should have warned you. But Everett, that you've spent 45 years seeing Simone as the child she used to be. The girl who fell off her bike, who needed you to leave shift for the emergency room, who cried when her goldfish died. You always saw the child she used to be. I began seeing the woman she was choosing to become. I'd held Constance's hand as she died, but I'd never imagined she was holding evidence of our daughter's betrayal. The final paragraph. I've built protections into the trust. Charles knows them. If she crosses certain lines, and I believe she will, you'll have legal recourse. But more importantly, you'll have a choice. You can use those protections to end this permanently, or you can give her one last chance to choose you over the money. Either way, you'll know you didn't imagine this. You'll know I saw it too. A handwritten postscript at the bottom. Give her one chance to choose you over the money. If she fails, you'll know you tried. I set the letter down. She knew, I said. For at least 18 months, Charles confirmed. Maybe longer. She documented Grant's photography. Simone's questions. She saw the pattern forming. Before I explain what weapon Constance built into that trust, I need to know something. If you were in my position, would you give your daughter that last chance, or would you end it immediately? Comment A if you'd give one final opportunity, or B if you'd use the legal protection now. Add one reason, just 5 to 10 words, so I can understand your thinking. A quick note, what follows includes some details shaped for emotional impact and narrative flow. The lesson behind the strategy is what matters here. Charles pulled out the trust document, turned to a section marked with a blue tab. Abuse Protection Clause, he read. Constance insisted on this language. She said if Simone ever crossed certain lines, you'd need a legal exit that didn't require proving anything in court. He read the conditions. If a designated heir or beneficiary isolates, the grantor manipulates financial information, coerces signatures, fabricates medical records, or attempts incompetence. Declaration for financial gain, their entitlement is immediately suspended and trustee designation revoked. What constitutes crossing the line, I asked. Forced signing, Charles said. Presenting documents with pressure to sign without proper review, or pressuring you to accept a psychiatric diagnosis as justification for reducing your autonomy. Either one triggers the clause. But, he paused. It has to be clear. Documented. Not just attempted manipulation, but overt coercion. I thought about the evidence I'd gathered. Hidden mail. Lily's recording. Elena's surveillance. Russell's withdrawals. The fraudulent psychiatric report with its pre-written conclusion. The psychiatric report alone isn't enough, I asked. How do you give someone a last chance when you already know they'll fail it? It's evidence of conspiracy, Charles said. But the clause requires an act against you specifically. They have to try to force your hand. Try to use that diagnosis to coerce a signature or institutionalization. That's when we activate the protection. So I wait. You wait for them to present the real authorization papers, the ones that matter. And when they pressure you to sign, when Simone uses the psychiatric evaluation as justification, when Grant threatens institutional placement, if you refuse, that's the moment. That's when the abuse clause triggers. I walked to the window, looked down at Austin, traffic blurring through morning commute. The evidence could end this now. Court's lawyers' public exposure of Simone's affair with Nolan, the fraud, the theft. But Constance's postscript echoed, give her one chance to choose you over the money. If she fails, you'll know you tried. I turned back to Charles. I need to give my daughter one last chance to choose. The November light was fading when Everett asked his daughter if she was happy. Simone stood by the backyard fence at 4847 Cliffside Drive, her silhouette sharp against the dimming sky. The evening of November 9th carried a chill that made Everett pull his cardigan tighter, but he'd chosen this moment deliberately. One last chance. That's what Constance's postscript had asked, for one final opportunity for Simone to choose connection over inheritance. "I've been thinking about your mother's letters," Everett began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "About what she wanted for us, for you." Simone turned, her expression unreadable. What about them? She believed in second chances. In family. He took a step closer, the dying grass crunching beneath his shoes. "Simone, if something's wrong, if you need help with anything, I want you to know I'm here. Not as a trustee, as your father." The silence stretched between them like a surgical incision. Then Simone's face hardened, her eyes reflecting something cold and final. "I don't need your help, Dad." Her voice carried no warmth, no hesitation. "I need you to respect the trust Mom set up, that's all." She walked past him toward the house, her footsteps deliberate. At the sliding door, she paused without turning back. "Sign the papers when they come." It's what she would have wanted. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a vault ceiling. Everett stood alone in the gathering dark, his daughter's rejection settling into his bones with a physician's clarity. He'd offered compassion. She'd chosen calculation. The moral test Constance had designed, it had just been failed. But here's what 37 years of cardiology teaches you, sometimes. The symptom you can see is masking the disease you can't. And 3 days later, Everett discovered what was truly controlling his daughter. November 12th, 8:15 p.m. Everett had returned to the house to retrieve a book he'd left in the study. The front door was unlocked, Simone's habit, when Grant was expected, so he entered quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone. Voices drifted from the dining room, Grant's tone low and sharp. "The 2022 tax issue, Russell. The one you forgot to disclose to the medical board." Everett froze in the hallway, his hand still on the study door. Russell Pierce's voice came through tight with strain. "That was resolved. The accountant made an error." "Resolved quietly," Grant interrupted. "Which means it's still reportable if someone were to file a complaint. Your license to practice medicine in Texas requires full disclosure of any tax penalties over $5,000. You paid $12,000 in penalties, Russell. I have the IRS documentation." A pause. Then Russell defeated, "What do you want?" "The competency report. November 20th. Exactly as we discussed. Memory deficits, impaired judgment, recommendation for immediate guardianship review." Grant's voice carried the smooth confidence of a man holding all the cards. "Do that, and the tax issue stays between us. Forever." Everett's medical training kicked in slow, your breathing, steady, your pulse maintained consciousness, but his mind raced with the implications. Grant wasn't just orchestrating the conspiracy. He was controlling it through blackmail, through leverage, through the systematic exploitation of other people's mistakes. He left the house the same way he'd entered, silent and unseen. The book could wait. This revelation couldn't. 2 days later, November 14th, at 2:10 p.m., Everett sat in his Civic in the First Republic Bank parking lot, watching the main entrance through windows tinted by afternoon sun. Grant's Tesla was parked 3 rows over. At 2:17, Grant emerged with a woman Everett didn't recognize, late 30s, dark blazer, bank ID badge visible even from this distance. They stood by the entrance, Grant gesturing as he spoke, the woman nodding and making notes on a tablet. Everett raised his phone and zoomed the camera. The woman's badge came into focus, Marcy Bell, processing officer. Grant handed her a folder, thick, official-looking. Marcy opened it, scanned the first page, then looked up with a professional smile. She said something Everett couldn't hear, but her body language was clear, accommodating, efficient, ready to expedite. The meeting lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Grant shook her hand with both of his, the gesture of a man sealing a deal, and Marcy returned inside carrying the folder like it contained something precious. Everett knew what was in that folder. authorization forms for the $3.8 million transfer, and Marcy Bell, age 39 processing officer, with the power to move those forms through the approval chain, had just been recruited to Grant's timeline. The pieces were falling into place with mechanical precision. Russell compromised, Nolan influenced, and now the bank officer expediting the very paperwork designed to strip Everett of everything Constance had built. But Everett had missed one final move, the one that would transform suspicion into legal certainty. November 16th, 7:15 a.m. Everett entered the kitchen at Cliffside Drive to find a thick bank envelope centered on the counter, like an offering on an altar. The return address read, First Republic Bank Trust Services Division. A yellow post-it note was affixed to the front, Simone's handwriting, unmistakable. Dad signed these today. We need them back Monday. S. Everett opened the envelope with hands that had once held human hearts mid-surgery. Inside authorization for trust, asset transfer, 23 pages of legal language with signature lines highlighted in yellow on pages 4, 11, and 19. The amount $3,800,000. The timeline immediate processing upon co-trustee authorization. And that post-it note, that casual coercive command. The abuse clause requires one clear act of coercion. This was it. The Thanksgiving turkey sat between them like evidence neither side wanted to acknowledge. 8 days. That's how long the authorization packet had sat unsigned in my study drawer, its yellow post-it note growing fainter with each hour of silence. 8 days since Simone demanded my signature today, since I'd recognized the coercive command for what it was, the trigger I needed. Now she stood at the head of the dining table at 4847 Cliffside Drive, pouring my wine with exaggerated care, her smile practiced and warm. Dad let me get that for you, she said, filling my glass to precisely the right level. You shouldn't have to reach. The November 24th evening carried the scent of roasted turkey and vanilla candles, white tapers flickering in their silver holders. 8 place settings, though only 5 of us would eat. Grant carved the bird with performative precision, his voice filling the room with market analysis. Market's been wild this quarter, he announced, separating breast from bone with surgical efficiency. Good thing we're keeping everything stable with the trust arrangements. I watched him work his hands, confident, his smile easy. This was choreography. 8 days of my silence had disrupted their timeline, and tonight's kindness was tactical repositioning warmth manufactured to soften tomorrow's pressure. Constance always said Thanksgiving was about what we're grateful for. I said quietly, not what we're planning. Simone's hand paused on the wine bottle for half a second. Then she smiled wider. Of course, Dad. We're grateful you're here with us. That's what matters. Lily sat across from me, 13 years old, and watchful, her plate barely touched. Her eyes moved from her mother's performance to my careful responses, reading the room with the intelligence of someone who'd learned too young that words and intentions don't always align. Elena Rodriguez moved through the dining room with deliberate slowness, refilling water glasses, straightening napkins, staying present longer than serving required. She caught my eye once, brief knowing, and I understood. She recognized the performance, too. Grant dominated the conversation with sports commentary, political observations, careful questions about my health that sounded concerned but felt like reconnaissance. How was I sleeping? Any trouble with memory? Had I been taking my medications regularly? Each question was a probe, each answer catalogued. Simone laughed at his jokes, touched my shoulder when she refilled my plate, asked about my preferences with a gentleness I hadn't heard in months. The woman who'd coldly rejected my offer of help 15 days ago was now the perfect daughter, attentive and warm. But I'd carved hundreds of Thanksgiving turkeys in this house, Constance laughing, Simone young and unguarded, the future stretching ahead with all its promise intact. Now I was carving through lies, and my daughter was the one serving them. Grandpa, are you okay? Lily's voice cut through Grant's monologue about football playoffs. The table went quiet. Simone's smile tightened. I'm fine, sweetheart, I said, meeting her eyes. How's school? It's okay. She pushed cranberry sauce around her plate. We're reading about government checks and balances in civics class. The irony wasn't lost on me. Checks and balances. The entire structure Constance had built into the trust, dual trustees, abuse clauses, attorney oversight, all designed to prevent exactly what was unfolding at this table. More wine, Mrs. Mercer? Elena's voice was professional, but her eyes held mine for a moment as she moved around the table. The look said, I see this. You're not alone. Grant cleared his throat, steering conversation back to safe territory. The Longhorns, the weather, holiday plans. Each topic designed to fill space, to normalize, to make tonight feel like family instead of strategy session. I tasted nothing. The turkey turned to ash in my mouth, the wine's finish bitter, despite its expensive label. I responded when spoken to, asked polite questions, played my role in their performance, but I was counting. Counting lies. Counting tactical touches. Counting hours until tomorrow morning, when kindness would shift to pressure, and I'd be forced to choose between compliance and open defiance. Simone's kindness was a sedative before surgery meant to relax you before the first cut. Dessert arrived, pumpkin pie with fresh whipped cream, Constance's recipe that Elena had perfected over 15 years. The irony of serving my dead wife's dessert while plotting to steal her legacy wasn't lost on me, even if it was lost on Simone. As Elena cleared the plates, Simone reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Warm, gentle, practiced. Dad, tomorrow morning, let's sit down together. Her voice carried the softness of concern, but her grip was firm. Just a few signatures, then everything's organized. Grant leaned forward, his smile encouraging. Should only take 20 minutes. I'll notarize everything right here. Simple and easy. Simone's thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand, the gesture intimate and controlling at once. Her eyes held mine warm and empty. We'll make this easy for you. There it was. The promise that was also a threat. The schedule that was also a demand. Tomorrow morning, 20 minutes, notarized, done. The coercive act wasn't the envelope with its yellow post-it. It was this, the manufactured warmth, the tactical positioning, the scheduled ambush dressed as family assistance. I smiled and said nothing. Let them think silence meant compliance. An hour later, after Simone and Grant had retired to their guest room, and Lily had gone upstairs, Elena found me in the kitchen. I was rinsing wine glasses, the mechanical task, keeping my hands busy while my mind cataloged evidence. She pulled out her phone without speaking and turned the screen toward me. A text message. Sent today at 5:47 p.m., an hour before dinner, from a number saved as GM. The message was short, sent to someone labeled MB. Thanksgiving tonight, signature tomorrow morning, notarized by noon. Transfer clears Monday. Marcy Bell. The processing officer who'd met with Grant in the bank parking lot 10 days ago. She wasn't just expediting paperwork. She was coordinating the endgame. I looked at Elena. She said nothing, just saved a screenshot and sent it to my phone. Then she squeezed my shoulder, once the same gesture Constance used to use, and left me standing in the kitchen with the evidence of tomorrow's ambush glowing in my hand. The black envelope sat in the center of the glass table, like a diagnosis Everett was supposed to accept without reading. Morning light filtered through the living room windows at 4847 Cliffside Drive, November 25th at 10:10 a.m. Exactly the timeline Elena's screenshot had revealed. Grant stood by the fireplace, coffee in hand, his posture relaxed. Simone gestured to the chair across from her, her smile warm and practiced. Dad, let's just take care of this quickly, then we can all relax. I sat. Grant moved to the table and opened the black envelope with ceremonial precision, spreading out pages of legal text across the glass surface. The header read, Asset Reallocation and Temporary Management Authorization. The language was simplified, shorter paragraphs, larger font, white space designed to make scanning easy and signing easier. but I recognized the structure immediately. If signed, Grant Mercer would control the trust portion that Constance had built over 30 years of careful stewardship. "This just helps us manage things while you rest," Simone said, sliding the first page toward me. "No stress, no complications." Grant settled into the chair beside her, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "Think of it as a safety net. We handle the details, you enjoy retirement." He placed Constance's Mont Blanc pen on top of the signature page, the pen she'd used to sign our mortgage, her hospital contracts, her will. Using it now was deliberate. A symbol weaponized. Constance would want me to read anything that uses her name as justification, I said quietly, picking up the pen. Simone's smile tightened fractionally. "Of course. Take your time." But her tone said, "Don't take too much time. Sign. Move on. Let us win." I read the first page slowly, then the second. The coffee on the table grew cold as I examined each clause, each provision no longer performing the confusion they expected. My mind processed legal language the way it had once processed cardiac pathology reports, systematically looking for the hidden risk. Page 4 contained the clause that made everything clear. Temporary authority granted herein may be extended indefinitely upon presentation of supporting medical documentation, indicating continued need for financial oversight and management assistance. I stopped, set the pen down, looked up at Grant. "What medical documentation?" Grant's exhale carried the edge of impatience he'd been suppressing for 20 minutes. "It's boilerplate trust language. Every document like this has protective clauses. This clause says temporary authority extends indefinitely with medical documentation." I tapped the paragraph with the pen. "What documentation?" Simone leaned forward, tension creeping into her voice despite the smile she maintained. "Dad, we've been over this. Dr. Pierce's evaluation shows you need support." There it was, the first card played. Decades of reading cardiac monitors taught me to spot the moment before arrest, the subtle pattern change that meant seconds to intervention. Grant's impatience was that pattern. The performance was cracking. I picked up the pen again and flipped back to page 2, where the effective date was listed. Then I pulled out my phone and opened the calendar, letting them watch me calculate. "The evaluation happened November 5th, I said, voice steady. 3 weeks ago, but this document references medical documentation dated before that appointment." Grant stood slightly, his hand pressing flat against the table. "You're confused about the timeline, Everett. This is exactly why we need." "I'm not confused." I met his eyes without blinking. "The document was prepared before the psychiatric evaluation that's supposed to justify it." Simone's hand moved to Grant's arm, a warning gesture, subtle but clear. "Slow down. Recalibrate." "Dad, you're reading too much into standard legal language." Her voice softened, trying to rebuild the warmth. "We're just trying to help." But I was done being helped. How many times had I explained consent to patients, the difference between informed agreement and coerced signature? How many times had I watched family members try to convince elderly parents to sign documents for their own good, while stripping away autonomy in the name of care? I'd sworn I'd never let it happen to me. Constance had sworn she'd built protections to prevent it, and here sat her daughter invoking her memory to justify exactly what those protections were designed to stop. I set the pen down with deliberate care and looked at the timeline again. Psychiatric evaluation, November 5th. Authorization packet arriving at my door, November 16th. This signing session, November 25th, scheduled before Thanksgiving dinner, coordinated with Marcy Bell at First Republic Bank. Every piece moving in sequence, every step planned. "Prudent planning," Grant said, reading my expression. "That's all this is. We anticipated you might need assistance. We arranged for proper evaluation, and now we're implementing reasonable safeguards." His language was too careful, too practiced. The words of a man who'd rehearsed justifications. I tapped the medical documentation clause one more time, then looked directly at Simone. The evaluation happened 3 weeks ago. This document references medical documentation dated before that appointment. I paused, letting the implications settle. Tell me about the timeline. Dad, evaluation on November 5th. Authorization packet on November 16th. Signing scheduled for November 25th. I kept my voice clinical diagnostic. All of it planned before Dr. Pierce ever met with me. Grant's jaw tightened. You're being paranoid and frankly, I cut him off with the question that would end the performance forever. Is that what Dr. Pierce is for supporting medical documentation for a trust seizure? The silence that followed lasted exactly 5 seconds. I counted them the way I'd once counted intervals between heartbeats, watching for the rhythm that meant cardiac failure. Grant recovered first, standing abruptly. The chair scraped against hardwood with a sound like tearing fabric. You're being paranoid and frankly insulting. But Simone stayed frozen, her eyes locked on my face, calculating, trying to determine whether I was guessing or whether I actually knew, whether this was bluff or evidence. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single photograph, the metadata page I'd photographed on November 5th, the one showing Dr. Russell Pierce's diagnostic report, the one with the timestamp that proved everything. Created October 29, 2025, 4:17 p.m., 6 days before the appointment that was supposed to generate it. Grant stared at the photograph like it was a diagnosis he hadn't expected. The metadata page sat on the glass table between us. Black text on white background. Irrefutable as a lab result. Created October 29, 2025. 4:17 p.m. Modified October 29, 2025. 4:19 p.m. Author Dr. R. Pierce, M.D. October 29, 4:17 p.m. I said, keeping my voice clinical. The report diagnosing my incompetence was written a week before the doctor examined me. Grant's recovery was fast practiced. He waved a dismissive hand at the photograph. You're misreading technical timestamps. Medical offices use templates. This isn't a template. I slid the photograph closer to him, forcing him to look at the details. It has my name, my birth date, and a conclusion about cognitive decline Dr. Pierce couldn't possibly have reached yet. The November 5th appointment was scheduled to provide legitimacy to a diagnosis that already existed. Simone's hand pressed flat against the table, steadying herself. Dad, you're confused about dates. This is exactly why. I pulled out my phone and opened the recording Lily had sent me weeks ago. The one she'd captured at the October dinner table when she thought I needed protection. I pressed play. Simone's voice filled the living room, clear and unmistakable. He'll be declared incompetent before Christmas. Pierce finishes the evaluation next week. Then we move the funds through the temporary management clause. Grant's voice followed. Russell's already signed off on the cognitive baseline. Nolan just needs to confirm decline from that point. Simone again. 3 weeks. That's all we need. I stopped the playback. The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, everyone waiting for impact. Movement on the stairs. Lily stood frozen on the landing, 13 years old, watching her mother's face as her own evidence played back. Her eyes were wide, caught between loyalty and horror. Grant's chair scraped violently as he stood. You've been recording us in our own home. Recording private conversations. Simone's voice rose sharp with indignation. That's illegal surveillance. Texas is a one-party consent state, I said quietly. Lily was part of the conversation. She had every legal right to record it. Lily's hands gripped the banister, her knuckles white. She didn't speak, didn't move. Just stood there listening to the proof that her mother had planned this conspiracy weeks before the examination that was supposed to justify it. I looked at Grant, then Simone. You needed my signature for the authorization. Why, if I'm incompetent, a court could grant you control without my consent. You wouldn't need the performance, the kindness, the manufactured signing session. Grant's jaw worked, searching for the legal argument that would explain away the recording, the metadata, the timeline that proved premeditation. But I wasn't finished. The abuse clause in Constance's trust requires clear evidence of financial exploitation or coercion. A court petition would trigger immediate scrutiny, attorney review, independent evaluation, oversight. You'd never get past Charles Whitmore, and you knew it. Simone's expression shifted. The solicitous daughter performance drained away, replaced by something colder and more familiar. The woman who'd rejected my offer of help in the backyard. The woman who'd looked at her father and seen only an obstacle. You think you're still competent? Her voice carried an edge I'd heard her use on incompetent vendors and disappointing staff. You're alone in this house. You refuse help. You're paranoid about everyone's motives. I documented a conspiracy, I said. That's not paranoia. That's evidence. Lily stood on the stairs, listening to her mother's recorded voice plot against her grandfather. The moment a child learns her parent is capable of cruelty, I could see it in her face. The recognition. The loss of innocence that comes when you discover the people you trust most are willing to lie, to manipulate, to justify theft as care. Simone turned to her daughter, her voice softening with practiced concern. Lily, sweetheart, this is complicated. Grandpa doesn't understand. She understands perfectly, I interrupted. She understood weeks ago when she recorded that dinner conversation. She understood what you were planning before I did. Grant moved toward the stairs, his posture threatening despite the careful neutrality of his expression. Lily, go to your room. Lily didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on mine. If you believed I was incompetent, I continued speaking to Simone, but watching Grant's approach to the stairs. You'd petition a court. You wouldn't need my signature. You wouldn't need the fraudulent psychiatric report or the manufactured timeline. Why the elaborate performance? Simone stood, her hands braced against the table. The pretense was gone entirely, now stripped away like surgical draping to expose the truth underneath. When does protection become imprisonment, and who gets to decide? I'd asked myself that question 1,000 times during my career, watching families struggle with elderly parents who refused care, who made dangerous decisions, who clung to independence past the point of safety. The line between honoring autonomy and preventing harm was never clear. But this wasn't that line. This was theft dressed as guardianship, control masquerading as concern. Why? Simone's voice cut through my thoughts hard and sharp. Because you can't take care of yourself, and you're too stubborn to admit it. There it was. Not concern, not medical necessity. Just the conviction that she knew better, that her judgment should override mine, that my autonomy was negotiable if she decided it was. I stood and walked to my briefcase by the door. Behind me, I heard Grant's movement stop Simone's sharp intake of breath. They were recalculating, trying to determine what else I had, what other evidence might exist. I pulled out a manila folder and set it on the glass table. Evidence stacked in chronological order, each page a documented piece of the conspiracy Constance's protections had been designed to prevent. The top page was visible, a photograph from the parking garage. Simone and Nolan Pierce, his hand on her back, her fingers on his lapel. The kiss that made everything personal instead of professional. I know about the affair, I said quietly. I know about Russell's withdrawals, Marcy Bell's expedited processing, Grant's blackmail, all of it. Simone looked at the photograph of her affair like someone watching their reflection shatter. The parking garage image sat atop the manila folder, Nolan Pierce's hand on her back, her fingers on his lapel, the kiss captured in sharp focus by surveillance camera. Timestamp October 14th, 2025. Below it, more photographs, bank statements, metadata printouts, the architecture of conspiracy laid out in chronological order. Grant moved first, reaching for the folder. I pulled it back. The house isn't mine, I said, keeping my voice level. It's Hale LLC property held in trust. You can't inherit what I don't personally own. Simone's smirk was reflexive automatic. We know the trust structure, Dad. That's exactly why. The transfer request is pending without valid signature. I continued as if she hadn't spoken. Nolan's psychiatric report was created October 29th, a week before the November 5th examination. Russell Pierce has been making carefully calibrated withdrawals, 6,200, 9,450, 11,000, all under the $12,000 reporting threshold. Grant's expression shifted when I produced the photocopy from beneath the evidence folder. A single-page, dense legal text highlighted in yellow. What is this? Grant's voice carried the first edge of real concern I'd heard all morning. The abuse protection clause Constance insisted on. I set the document on the table where both of them could read it. It defines exactly what you've been doing. Grant picked it up, scanning the highlighted sections. His jaw tightened as he read. Simone leaned over his shoulder, her eyes moving across the text. Financial exploitation, isolation from support systems, fabricated medical evidence, attempted coercion of legal signature. Each provision matched an action she and Grant had taken, each condition they'd satisfied with methodical precision. You knew, Grant said, slowly looking up at me. You've known about this clause the entire time. Constance explained it when we signed the trust documents, I said. She believed in second chances, but she also believed in consequences. Simone's face hardened. The smirk vanished, replaced by calculation. She pushed the authorization papers across the table toward me, her movement sharp and deliberate. Dad, sign it now. Her voice carried command, not request. Stop this paranoid performance, for your own good. Grant stood, his posture aggressive. We have Dr. Pierce's evaluation. We can move forward with medical authority whether you cooperate or not. I pulled out my phone, pressed the record button, and set it on the table between us with the red light visible. You're attempting coerced signature using fabricated medical evidence and concealed financial manipulation. I spoke clearly, each word deliberate. I'm documenting this moment. 38 years of cardiac interventions taught me the moment between diagnosis and treatment is when patients reveal who they are. Some accept reality with grace. Others fight until the monitors flatline. Simone was revealing herself now, not as my daughter seeking to help, but as someone willing to destroy autonomy in pursuit of control. The doorbell chimed, cutting through the tension like a scalpel through tissue. I stood and walked to the door. Behind me, Grant's voice rose. Don't answer that. We're not finished. I opened the door. Charles Whitmore stood on the threshold, 65 years old, silver-haired and formal in his navy suit. Beside him, Marcy Bell, 39, dark blazer, her bank ID still clipped to her lapel. Her presence made Grant freeze mid-sentence. Everett, Charles said with a slight nod. May we come in? I stepped aside. They entered, Charles carrying a leather briefcase, Marcy empty-handed but visibly uncomfortable. Grant's face had gone pale. Marcy addressed me first, her voice professional but strained. Mr. Hale, I need to formally correct the pending transfer request. I discovered significant inconsistencies between the medical documentation and authorization signatures. The request has been suspended pending investigation. Grant found his voice. Marcy, we had an agreement. You offered me money to expedite fraudulent documents. Marcy's voice was quiet but clear. That's federal banking fraud, Mr. Mercer. I contacted Mr. Whitmore yesterday. Charles set his briefcase on the hall table and pulled out a document. Not a photocopy this time, an original notarized and sealed. The evidence satisfies all abuse clause conditions, Charles said, his attorney voice filling the room with formal precision. Isolation. Dr. Pierce's fabricated evaluation claiming social withdrawal. Financial manipulation, Russell Pierce's structured withdrawals, and Marcy Bell's attempted expedited processing. Fabricated medical evidence, the October 29th report, created before examination. Coerced signature attempt documented this morning. Simone's anger erupted. This is ridiculous. He's paranoid. He's been spying on us, recording private. It didn't have to be, I said quietly. The simplicity of the statement stopped her. For a moment, I saw something in her face that might have been recognition, might have been regret. Then it hardened again into justification. Charles continued, his voice carrying the weight of legal finality. Effective immediately, Simone Mercer is suspended as beneficiary and removed from trustee consideration pending formal review. The Hale Margaret Cardiac Relief Fund remains protected under charitable trust provisions. All pending transfers are void. The declaration hung in the air like a verdict. Lily stood against the wall, watching her mother lose an inheritance and watching her grandfather lose a daughter. Simone turned to her, reaching out with the desperation of someone watching everything collapse. Sweetheart, you understand Grandpa isn't well. He doesn't know what he's doing. He needs help, and we're just trying. Lily stepped back, away from her mother's hand, away from the justification and the performance. Her voice was small, but perfectly clear. I recorded you, Mom, in October. Grandpa didn't spy on you, I did. The room went silent. Not the silence of people thinking what to say next, but the silence of a fracture too deep for words. Simone stared at her daughter, at the 13-year-old girl who'd chosen documentation over denial, evidence over loyalty. The one witness she'd never seen coming. The screen in Charles's office showed 2 words in green reversed /under review. 24 hours after Lily's confession, fractured my family beyond repair, I sat in a leather chair watching institutional systems dismantle what Simone and Grant had spent months building. November 26th, morning light filtered through Charles Whitmore's office windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like evidence waiting to settle. Charles turned the monitor toward me, his finger indicating the bank's internal status display. Grant's attempted transfer, the one that required fabricated medical reports and coerced signatures, now carried a red flag, fraud investigation pending. The transfer reversed overnight. Charles said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a lawyer watching justice function as designed. First Republic flagged it the moment Marcy submitted her correction. I stared at the screen. The amount, $3,800,000, sat frozen in trust protection, exactly where Constance had positioned it 30 years ago. 24 hours, I said quietly. They built this for months and it collapsed in a day. That's what happens when the foundation is fraud. Charles closed the banking portal and opened another file. Marcy Bell's internal memos are remarkably detailed. She documented every interaction with Grant, dates, times, his exact language, requesting expedited handling based on anticipated medical authorization. Bank-generated evidence that proves premeditation. He spread documents across his desk with the systematic precision of someone building a case. Metadata photographs showing October 29th timestamps. Lily's recording transcript, her 13-year-old handwriting, in the margins noting dates and speakers. Elena Rodriguez's signed testimony about the October conversation she'd overheard. Russell Pierce's withdrawal ledger showing the carefully calculated amounts. Marcy's memos. The parking garage photographs, Simone and Nolan Pierce, the affair that made medical fraud personal. Every piece of the conspiracy laid out in chronological order. This goes to Oversight Council within 48 hours, Charles said, pulling a document from his briefcase. Every piece of evidence chronologically documented. But first, I need your authorization to proceed with formal trust enforcement. He slid the papers toward me. Authorization for legal action on behalf of Hale Medical Trust. I picked up the pen, not Constance's Mont Blanc this time, just Charles's office ballpoint, and started reading, line by line, clause by clause, understanding exactly what I was signing. Charles waited without impatience, letting me process the legal language at my own pace. When I reached a provision about permanent beneficiary removal, I stopped. What happens next? I asked. Charles leaned back in his chair, the movement deliberate. That depends on what you want to happen. I'd signed thousands of medical documents over 38 years, consent forms, procedure authorizations, death certificates. Documents that changed lives, ended suffering, marked transitions between one state and another. But I'd never signed papers that could send my daughter to prison. The pen felt heavier than it should. I signed the authorization and set the pen down. What are the options? Charles pulled another document from the stack, this one marked Confidential Legal Analysis. Civil remedies are already in motion. The abuse clause activation removed Simone as beneficiary and suspended her trust access. That's permanent unless she successfully challenges the evidence, which she can't. He paused, giving me space to absorb that reality. My daughter would never inherit what Constance had built. The Hale Medical Trust would bypass Simone entirely, distributing to the charitable foundation and whatever contingent beneficiaries Constance had designated. But the evidence also supports criminal charges. Charles continued, his voice careful. Conspiracy to commit fraud, elder financial abuse under Texas Penal Code, falsifying medical records. The Travis County DA would take this case immediately if we present it. All of them, I asked. Nolan Russell grants Simone. Nolan Pierce could lose his medical license and face criminal prosecution for fabricating psychiatric evaluations. Russell faces embezzlement charges for the structured withdrawals. Grant and Simone face conspiracy and fraud charges as the primary orchestrators. Charles placed the legal analysis in front of me. Sentencing guidelines. Potential prison terms. The machinery of criminal justice laid out in clinical detail. Is justice supposed to feel this empty? I'd won. The conspiracy had collapsed. The trust was protected. Constance's legacy would fund cardiac relief for families who couldn't afford treatment, exactly as she'd intended. Simone would never touch the inheritance she'd tried to steal. But victory tasted like ash. Prison time, I asked, though I already knew the answer. For all of them, Charles confirmed. Elder financial abuse carries enhanced penalties in Texas. Add conspiracy, fraud, medical falsification. We're looking at significant sentences. He closed the legal analysis and met my eyes with the directness of someone who'd known me for 30 years, who'd drafted Constance's will, who'd watched Simone grow up and attended her wedding. But that's your choice to make, Everett. His voice carried weight without pressure. The civil protections are automatic abuse clause activation, beneficiary removal, trust preservation. Those happen regardless. Criminal prosecution requires your cooperation and testimony. He tapped the evidence stack, once a gesture that encompassed metadata timestamps and affair photographs, and a 13-year-old's recording. Now we decide what happens to them. The question hung in the air between us. Not a legal question anymore. A moral one. The kind Constance would have asked me to consider, carefully weighing consequences against principles, justice against mercy. I looked at the evidence spread across Charles's desk and thought about Lily standing on the stairs yesterday, confessing she'd recorded her mother. Choosing truth over loyalty at 13 years old. What's Lily's legal exposure? I asked. She made the recording. She's a minor. She's Simone's daughter. Charles's expression shifted, still professional, but softer. Texas is a one-party consent state. The recording is legal. Lily was part of the conversation. She had every right to document it. But Lily's relationship with her mother. Charles paused, choosing words carefully. That's not a legal question, Everett. That's a different kind of damage entirely. Russell Hayes looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. The damage to Lily's relationship with Simone was beyond legal remedy, Charles had said. But legal remedies were still proceeding for everyone else. Russell had requested this meeting at a small cafe on the east side, away from anyone who might recognize either of us. November 27th, mid-afternoon, the place nearly empty. He sat across from me, coffee untouched, dark circles under his eyes, making him look older than 51. His hands fidgeted with a manila envelope that sat between us like evidence waiting to be entered. "Thank you for meeting me," he said quietly. I waited. I'd learned that silence often extracted more truth than questions. Russell opened the envelope and pulled out a ledger, handwritten annotations in the margins, dates and amounts highlighted in yellow. The withdrawals I'd documented from Constance's letters: 6,200, 9,450, 11,000. Each one carefully calibrated to stay under the $12,000 reporting threshold. Grant had documentation of a tax issue from 2022. Russell said, his voice tight. "A mistake my accountant made. I paid the penalties, filed corrections, thought it was resolved. But Grant kept copies. He said he'd send it to the IRS and the medical board if I didn't help." I looked at the ledger. Russell's handwriting. Russell's signature on withdrawal authorizations. Russell's medical license used to justify health-related expenses that were actually systematic embezzlement. "Why come forward now?" Russell's laugh was bitter. "Because Grant's not protecting me anymore. He's already telling people I acted alone, that I manipulated the trust without his knowledge that he's as much a victim as you are." The conspiracy was collapsing like a cardiac cascade. One system failure triggering the next, each participant trying to save themselves instead of the whole. Grant was cutting Russell loose. Simone was losing her daughter. Nolan's career was ending. The architecture of betrayal dismantling itself from within. "What do you want from me?" I asked. Russell pushed the annotated ledger across the table. "The truth. These are Grant's instructions, dates, amounts, exactly what he told me to withdraw and when. He planned every detail. I'm not innocent, Dr. Hale. I should have refused, should have reported him. But I didn't." He pulled out another document, emails between him and Grant, text messages with coded language about medical expense reimbursements and trust administration. Evidence that Grant orchestrated everything. "I can't promise to save you, Russell," I said quietly, "but the truth will hurt less than covering for him." Russell nodded, the movement carrying exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "I know." I took the documents and left him sitting in the cafe staring at his cold coffee like it held answers he'd lost months ago. The next morning, Charles and I stood outside Nolan Pierce's clinic at 11:20 a.m. The building was modern glass and steel, the kind of professional space that projected competence and discretion. A psychiatrist's practice built on trust. We were about to destroy it. Nolan's receptionist led us to his office, leather chairs, abstract art diplomas framed on walls that spoke of credentials and expertise. Nolan stood when we entered, his 51 years, carried with the polish of someone who'd built a successful practice on careful image management. "Everett," he said with professional warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "I wasn't expecting you." "This is Charles Whitmore," I said, "my attorney." The warmth vanished. Nolan's expression shifted to careful neutrality as Charles set his briefcase on the desk and pulled out documents. The metadata printout, appointment schedules, timeline analysis. "We need to discuss your evaluation of Mr. Hale," Charles said, spreading the evidence across Nolan's expensive desk. "Specifically, the report you created on October 29th, 7 days before you met with him." Nolan picked up the metadata page, scanning it with the trained eye of someone looking for technical escape routes. "Document metadata can be misleading. Templates are often created in advance. This wasn't a template," Charles interrupted, his voice carrying courtroom precision. "It had Mr. Hale's name, diagnosis, and conclusions dated October 29th. You met him November 5th. The report included specific observations about his cognitive state that you couldn't possibly have made before examining him." Nolan set the page down carefully. Too carefully. The gesture of someone trying to maintain control while their foundation cracked. "I don't appreciate the implication." "It's not an implication," I said quietly. "It's documentation." Charles pulled out another sheet, the formal complaint filed with the Texas Medical Board that morning. Nolan's face went pale as he read the header. I'd once trusted Nolan Pierce's professional judgment enough to recommend him to colleagues. Now I was watching his career end in real time. We also have testimony from Russell Hayes, Charles continued, documenting the conspiracy, and witness accounts of your relationship with Simone Mercer, the affair that made this evaluation personally compromised, in addition to chronologically impossible. Nolan's professional composure was fragmenting. His hands pressed flat against his desk, steadying himself. Drafting evaluation frameworks ahead of time is common practice in psychiatry. It doesn't invalidate the assessment. The words hung in the air. Not quite a confession. Not quite a denial. Just enough admission to prove the report existed before the examination, exactly what we needed. Charles closed his briefcase with a decisive click. We'll let the board decide what's common. Outside in the parking lot, November sun cutting through cold air, Charles pulled out his phone and checked the confirmation email. The board has 90 days to investigate. His license is suspended pending review. I looked back at the clinic, its glass walls reflecting clouds and sky. He almost got away with it. Almost only works in horseshoes, Charles said. His own defense just became our evidence. We drove in silence for 10 minutes, the weight of systematic accountability settling around us. The conspiracy had collapsed. The conspirators were turning on each other. Legal mechanisms were grinding toward justice, but justice felt hollow. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, then something made me answer. Hello. Simone's voice came through tight with something I hadn't heard in months. Not anger, not defiance. Fear. We need to talk about Lily. Everett handed his daughter the formal occupancy notice like a prescription she refused to fill. Simone's frightened phone call about Lily had led to this moment, November 29th evening, at the Austin House, the property that had always belonged to Hale LLC, held in trust, never personally owned by anyone. The document I placed on the dining table was simple: 72 hours to vacate or sign a new occupancy agreement under trust terms with rent. Simone stared at the notice like it was written in a language she didn't understand. Then her expression shifted from confusion to fury. You're kicking me out. Her voice rose sharp and disbelieving. Your own daughter. The house belongs to the trust, I said quietly. It always has. You were living here as my guest, not as owner. Grant appeared from the kitchen, reading over Simone's shoulder. His jaw tightened as he processed the legal language. This is vindictive. You're punishing her for trying to help you. I'm enforcing property rights you tried to steal. The symbolic justice was deliberate. Simone had treated this house as hers, redecorating, hosting parties, planning to inherit it, along with everything else Constance had built. But the house had never been mine to give. It was trust property protected by the same legal architecture that had stopped the conspiracy. She'd called it her childhood home while plotting to take what it represented. Now she was learning the difference between living somewhere and owning it. 72 hours, Grant read from the notice. Or we pay rent. Market rate, I confirmed. Or you find other accommodations. Simone's hands shook as she set the paper down. I hate you. The words should have hurt more than they did. But hatred required energy I no longer had for her. I know, I said, and left them to process what came next. Later that evening, after Grant had stormed out and the house had gone quiet, Simone found me in the kitchen. The frightened tone from her phone call was visible now. Her eyes red, her posture smaller than I'd seen since the confrontation. What are you going to do about Lily? The question came out raw, stripped of performance. Turn her against me completely. This was what had frightened her. Not the eviction, not the inheritance loss. The possibility that I'd weaponize her daughter the way she'd weaponized everything else. Lily will make her own decisions, I said. I'll answer her questions honestly and pay for therapy. That's it. Simone's voice carried suspicion beneath the fear. No custody fight, no poisoning her against me. She's 13 years old, Simone. She needs her mother, even a flawed one. The words landed harder than I'd intended. Simone's face crumpled for a moment, before hardening again into defensive anger. You think you're so noble. I think she deserves better than being used as leverage by either of us. I delivered hundreds of terminal diagnoses, learned to separate clinical truth from human cruelty. But hearing your daughter justify stealing your life because you'd die eventually, that required a different kind of detachment. Simone stood there for another moment, searching my face for something she didn't find. Then she turned and walked upstairs to begin packing. November 30th evening arrived with boxes stacked in the driveway and Grant's SUV loaded with the remnants of a life that had never been as permanent as Simone believed. She moved through the house with mechanical efficiency, stripping it of everything she'd added over the years, artwork, furniture, the performative touches that had made it feel like hers. I stayed out of her way, letting her take what wasn't trust property. The photographs from the walls, the kitchen gadgets Constance had never used, the symbols of occupation mistaken for ownership. At 8:10 p.m., as dusk turned the front yard purple-gray, Simone carried the last box to the car. Grant was already in the driver's seat, engine running, ready to leave. She set the box down and turned to face me. The mask was completely gone now. No more solicitous daughter, no more justified intervention, no more strategic positioning. Just raw anger and something that might have been grief if she'd let it be. You were going to die anyway, she said, her voice cutting through the November cold. In 5 years, 10 maybe. We were just planning ahead for what would be ours eventually. Watching Simone pack was like watching a patient refuse treatment. I could explain the consequences, but I couldn't force her to choose differently. I looked at my daughter, 43 years old, standing in a driveway, ready to drive away from any possibility of reconciliation. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was justifying. Still, even now, that's why what we do before we die matters, Simone, I said quietly. That's the whole point. She stared at me for 5 seconds. Maybe searching for the father who would relent, who would choose relationship over principle, who would let her win because losing her was worse than losing the truth. But I'd already lost her. Months ago, maybe years. The conspiracy hadn't created the distance, it had revealed what was already gone. I hope you enjoy your empty house and your righteous victory, she said, picking up the final box. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't just be performance. She loaded the box, climbed into the passenger seat, and Grant pulled away without looking back. The taillights disappeared around the corner, red dots fading into darkness. I stood in the driveway as silence settled around me. The house behind was quiet, legally secure, financially protected, completely empty. The November air carried the scent of endings, wood smoke, and cold earth, and the absence where family used to be. I pulled out my phone and opened my photos, scrolling back through years until I found it. Thanksgiving, 15 years ago. Constance laughing at something Simone had said, her eyes bright and unguarded. Simone at 28, before Grant, before fundraising politics, taught her to calculate relationships like investments. All of us together in this same house, the future still full of possibilities we hadn't destroyed yet. I didn't delete it. Couldn't. Instead, I created a new folder and labeled it Before. Then I saved the photograph and went inside alone. Everett loaded the last box into his car as dawn broke over the house he'd fought to keep and chosen to leave. The photo labeled Before stayed on my phone, but the house that contained those memories had become something else. A battlefield won at the cost of everything it once represented. December 5th morning carried the sharp cold of Texas winter, the kind that makes breath visible and decisions clear. I closed the trunk and looked back at 4847 Cliffside Drive. Legally mine, financially secure, completely empty of the people who'd made it matter. I'd told Charles 2 days ago that I was moving to a small apartment near the hospital where I'd practiced for 38 years. You won the house, he'd said, confused. I kept the house to prove a point, I'd replied. Now I'm leaving it to make one I don't need what I don't want. Ownership without peace was another form of prison. Freedom came from choosing what mattered. Footsteps behind me. I turned to find Lily running across the lawn in pajamas and a winter coat, her 13-year-old face urgent with something between fear and determination. She crashed into me with a hug that felt like absolution I didn't deserve. "You'll still see me, right?" Her voice was muffled against my jacket. "For math." I held her tight, this granddaughter who'd chosen truth over loyalty when it mattered most. Every Tuesday, pizza and polynomials. She pulled back and pressed a folded paper into my hand. "Don't read it now. Later." Then she ran back inside before I could respond, the door closing, with the soft finality of chapters ending. I got in the car and drove 3 miles before pulling over to unfold the note. 2 words in Lily's careful handwriting, "I knew." My hands shook as I called her. She answered on the first ring. "You knew," I asked, "that Mom was wrong." Her voice carried the weight of months of silent observation. "I just didn't know how to say it until you did." I held the note like the last thread connecting me to family. Not the family I'd imagined. The one that remained real. 10 days later, I sat in the Hale Margaret Cardiac Relief Fund office with Charles signing documents that reinforced Constance's medical charity. The money Simone had tried to steal would now save lives. My wife would have chosen cardiac patients lacking insurance. Families facing impossible choices between treatment and bankruptcy. Charles slid a file across the desk. First case under the expanded allocation. I opened it. 8-year-old girl. Mitral valve prolapse. Surgery required $68,000. Family coverage $21,000. Shortfall $47,000. The kind of number that meant selling houses, draining retirement, choosing between one child's life and another's college fund. I looked at the photograph, clipped to the file, dark hair in braids, gap-toothed smile, holding a soccer ball like it contained her whole future. Constance used to say, "The heart knows the truth before the mind accepts it." I'd felt Simone slipping away for years, but kept diagnosing it as distance instead of departure. But this 8-year-old who'd never meet Constance, but would live because of her, this was the truth worth preserving. "Approve it," I said. Charles made a note. "The fund can now support 12 additional surgeries annually with the protected allocations. Constance would be proud." I stood and walked to the donor board on the wall, brass plaques, listing the foundation's history. Top center, Constance Margaret Hale, founder, 1995 to 2025. Her name would outlive the conspiracy that tried to corrupt her legacy. I smiled genuinely for the first time since her death. "You were right about everything," I whispered to her memory. "I should have listened sooner." Christmas Eve arrived with the quiet weight of first winters alone. My apartment was small, 1-bedroom, kitchenette, living room, barely large enough for the modest tree I'd bought at the grocery store. Yellow lights wrapped around branches, Constance's photograph on the shelf beside it, the space holding everything that remained true. I sat at the small table, with a notebook, not claiming victory, but documenting truth. The kind of record I'd kept throughout my medical career observations, without judgment, facts, without embellishment, the simple clarity of what happened. November 24th, Thanksgiving dinner, Simone's performance. The beginning I'd missed by months, maybe years. November 25th, the signing attempt, the metadata, the confession. November 26th, transfer reversed, abuse clause activated. The dates marched forward through conspiracy and consequence, through evidence and exposure, through the systematic dismantling of a betrayal Constance had anticipated and protected against. I wrote about Lily's note. The 8-year-old's surgery scheduled for January 4th. The apartment that felt more like home than the house I'd left behind. Grief and relief can occupy the same space like systole and diastole. The heart contracts and expands, loss and peace in alternating rhythm. I didn't wait for Simone to return. Didn't expect reconciliation or apology. She'd made her choice, and I'd finally stopped pretending it was temporary confusion instead of permanent character. I kept what remained true, Constance's memory preserved in work that saved lives. A granddaughter who saw me clearly and chose connection anyway. The simple dignity of accepting reality without bitterness. I looked at Constance's photograph, the one from our 40th anniversary. Her eyes bright with the mischief that had sustained us through decades of shared purpose. "You saw her becoming this," I said quietly. "I kept seeing the child she used to be." The conspiracy hadn't stolen my daughter. It had revealed who she'd chosen to become while I clung to memories of who she'd been. I closed the notebook and wrote one final line. I didn't lose a daughter. I finally stopped mistaking who she chose to be. I stood and walked to the window. Below, a family loaded presents into their car, their laughter rising through the cold Christmas Eve air. I didn't feel envy or regret. I felt the weight of a life lived with intention, mistakes included. Tomorrow I'd visit Lily for Christmas breakfast. Next week, an 8-year-old girl would get the valve surgery that meant birthdays and graduations and a future her family couldn't have bought alone. The story didn't end with restoration. It ended with truth, and truth I finally understood was enough. And to you listening to my story, remember this: truth doesn't always feel like victory, but it's the only foundation worth standing on. I spent years mistaking silence for peace, distance for privacy. I saw what I wanted to see in my daughter, instead of who she was choosing to become. Don't make my mistake. Don't ignore the pattern because you love the person creating it. Sometimes the hardest diagnosis to accept is the one about someone you've loved your whole life. Here's what I learned. Protecting what matters sometimes means losing what you love. Constance built that trust with protections because she knew, before I did, that love doesn't guarantee loyalty. The abuse clause wasn't paranoia. It was wisdom. I believe God's timing brought everything to light exactly when truth could no longer be ignored. My wife's legacy now saves lives instead of funding betrayal. That's not the ending I wished for, but it's the one that honors what we built together. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you faced a moment where truth cost you something precious? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about family legacy and the choices that define us, please subscribe. Your support means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. This story contains fictional elements woven into real-life lessons about trust, family, and the courage to choose truth over comfort. What matters most is the message.